This week, Vicarius' very own Roi Cohen and Shani Dodge join us to kick off the show with a technical segment titled Generating Threat Insights Using Data Science. Next up, Harry Sverdlove from ZScaler joins us for a technical segment on securing the enterprise software supply chain. I wonder where we got that topic from. In the security news, how suspected Russian hackers outed their massive cyber attack, where we'll talk about SolarWinds. And if we get a chance not to talk about SolarWinds, millions of unpatched IoT and OT devices threaten critical infrastructure. Zodiac Killer's cipher has been solved, and a security researcher states SolarWinds 123 password left the firm vulnerable in 2019. More SolarWinds. Why the weakest links matter, and a 26-year-old turns a mistake into being added to honors geometry class to becoming a rocket scientist. All that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly.
Sophisticated attackers are targeting credentials to escalate privileges. Ativo Networks provides an innovative solution that finds, cleans, and monitors exposed credentials to reduce attack surfaces. Additionally, the solution alerts when attackers try accessing Active Directory objects while hiding data and derailing them with disinformation. Organizations can go one step further and hide real credentials among deceptive lures that lead attackers to decoys for recording TTPs and forensic evidence. Find out more at securityweekly.com/Ativo Networks and sign up for a free trial. NetSparker, the developers of a comprehensive automated web security platform that includes web vulnerability scanning, assessment, and management. NetSparker's desktop and cloud-based security solutions employ a unique and dead-accurate vulnerability scanning engine that automatically verifies vulnerabilities and provides a proof of concept. For more information, visit them on the web at securityweekly.com/NetSparker. Want to be more thorough while also working faster? It doesn't matter if you're on the red or blue team, an augmented reality overlay can enable you to be more thorough and faster at the same time. No glasses, no goggles. Polarity delivers this superpower as an overlay on top of your existing workflow and tools. The free Community Edition connects to the data you care about to overlay the context you need to make informed decisions. Apply for early access today at securityweekly.com/polarity.
And welcome to the show. But first, let me introduce you to a man whose jacket outside is frightful, and throwing it on the fire would be delightful. Mr. Paul Asadorian.
Welcome, everyone, to Security Weekly. This is episode number 678, recorded December 17th, 2020, right here in G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island. Thanks, Larry. You like my jacket, huh? Mr. Larry Pesce is here.
It really is.
Virtually here. Thank you. There's pants to go with it, but I didn't bother because no one sees the pants. I didn't bother wearing the matching pants. Never mind. Mr. Lee Neely is here with us. Lee, welcome. And Lee is on mute. It looked like a great introduction, though, didn't it? Well, let's try that again. And Mr. Lee Neely is here with us.
Hey there, here I am with my long sleeve Hawaiian shirt. This time I'm not on mute and ready to party.
It looks like a pajama top.
It does. It does look like pajamas. Shh. Mr. Jeff Mann is here with us now that he spoiled that. He's here. Hey, Jeff.
Surprise, I'm here.
Hanging in there with us tonight also Mr. Tyler Robinson. He's got an apparatus. We're just going to try and keep his brain off of whatever kind of pain you might be in, my friend.
Appreciate it. Small apparatus.
Yes. For those not viewing the video, it's quite a large apparatus. Do you always...
It's just, without context, you might give them a little bit...
Now so many people are going to go watch the video, not Tyler. Do you always end up missing our live streams? Need somewhere to flag Security Weekly podcast that you want to listen to? Subscribe on your favorite podcast catcher or our YouTube channel. Sign up for our mailing list and join our Discord server and stay in the loop. All things Security Weekly. Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe. This segment is sponsored by Vicarius. To learn more, please visit securityweekly.com/Vicarius. Joining us today from Vicarius are two now friends of the show because they've been on so many times. We love having them, Roi Cohen and Shani Dodge. Welcome back.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for having us.
Hi, good to be here again.
Nice to have you both. We're going to be talking about generating threat insights using data science. I'm excited. I want to learn more about the data science that helps most with vulnerability prioritization. You may know a thing or two about that, I'm told.
Yeah, it's a super interesting topic, given the fact that there are so many data points today that companies need to consider, right? There are so many feeds. I think you read in the news day in and day out about new incidents, which resulted by, some of them at least, by software vulnerabilities and issues like that. And it's very hard to expect one in a given company to really try to understand what they should do. Because of the fact there is the inflation of data. And just a recap, in the previous sessions where we discussed a bit about how we predict vulnerabilities, how we can also protect them in the memory, and a couple of sessions about prioritization. But looking beyond the horizon, there is like this need that there will be so many data points where a company needs to really having something to focus on the most critical threats. And we need to create, maybe rely on existing frameworks, like we'll be discussing a bit about the MITRE framework, and how we can facilitate algorithms in order to really help us to better focus on the things that matter. So this is kind of what we wanted to discuss for today.
Yeah, it's really awesome. We were talking about this today. That combination of supervised and unsupervised learning was kind of the lesson that I was getting today, that you can have users tag content, but also based on behavior and other factors, you can automatically tag that content. It sounds like you're doing something similar inside the product today.
Yeah, definitely. And when it comes to tagging, eventually it should also be consistent of something that a company can relate to. So I want to start by showing. I think we should all be quite familiar with that, with MITRE's attack framework. Obviously, it goes through the different steps of the attack, from the reconnaissance up until the impact. And the two, let's call it the mitigation, which can also are connected tightly to the techniques, are things that we kind of discussed about. And the patches protection obviously is something that, in terms of mitigation, relates to exploit protection. And there are different techniques that it basically covers. And of course, the patching that we also are covering covers some other techniques. And eventually, when you have again, the inflation of data, you need to, and you want to have standards which you're going to rely on. The MITRE attack framework is one thing that we can really look up to. And there is a case study we want to share. We have this customer, which is a huge enterprise. And when we started the discussion with, basically he told us he got two scanners inside his network, two vulnerability scanners, and multiple feeds of data, threat intelligence and darknet analysis, and the CERT, which basically feeds them with the threats. And we asked him, how are you basically processing this huge amount of data points in order to make a decision? He says, I really cannot. It's really hard. It's a very specific task. And he kind of also showed us that he tries to correlate things back to the techniques in MITRE. And this is why we wanted to go through this today. And Shani will be elaborating a bit more about the different data points and data sets that would be used for the models and for the algorithms. So over to you, Shani.
Thank you, Roy. So, I really relate to the example you just mentioned, because I deeply believe that the biggest challenge in the 2020s is not collecting data, but processing it and turning it into knowledge and insights. And I'll just share my screen with you. And I made kind of a really simple example of a organization's data, right? So here is, of course, really little and not, and of course in an organization it's much bigger, much more information. But here we have around. Well,
also, I think in the real world, Shani, there's a lot more criticals and highs than maybe you have listed there.
Of course, of course. Here there's just only 4 servers, 4 desktops, around, I guess, 10 applications, maybe 20 vulnerabilities. That's really not the real world. But if we're looking at that and we're asking ourselves, how can we analyze all this information? And these are, 50 rows only. So we can try manually, but it seems quite hard to me. And we might try, basic statistics or kind of predefined rules, but it feels outdated. So, Paul, what do you think would be a better way to analyze this information?
I think my vote would be with machine learning.
Yeah. So I really relate to what you say. And I think that applying machine learning algorithms is like the future. And there's different algorithms and different methods, but we'll be speaking a bit about the machine learning. And
I think machine learning gets a bad rep because there are people who claim that they do machine learning, but it's really not machine learning. Like just basic matching is not machine learning. And then it seems to me the ones that actually do machine learning in some capacity, as you're about to describe, Shani, don't kind of like tout that as their like primary feature, for example. So I think you fit that mold very well, and that this is all last segment of the year you've done several, and now we're talking about machine learning, which has always kind of been there in the background.
Right. So, but just a moment before we start to discuss how can we apply machine learning and create a customized threat identification process or model, let's just define, what is exactly machine learning. So actually, it's a task of training a function that maps an input to an output. And there are different types. One is the supervised learning. This refers to learning that is based on labeled data, meaning input and output pairs. An example of using this supervised learning would be to solve a classification problem. And, I hope you all familiar with the Google Photos app, because they have really cool features. And I want to show you one of them. The one that recognizes things such as food, sky, cars. So this is a really good example of classifying using a supervised learning. And why is that? Because the programmers in Google sat down and took some photos of cars and labeled them as cars, and then photos of sky and labeled them as sky, and trained a model. And now when that model runs on our app, it goes over all the photos, and when it sees car, it groups it into cars, and so on and so on.
Yeah, Shani, I find it's about 80% correct in Google Photos. But it is a shining example of machine learning. I think Moxie Spike gave the analogy of you showed a bunch of pictures of cats. Now the application can recognize cats. When you show random pictures, it'll tell you which ones are cats and which ones are not.
Right. And if we'll keep on, so there's another type of unsupervised learning, right, where we detect patterns in dataset that aren't labeled. And a good example, a good usage of this unsupervised learning would be solving a clustering problem. For example, if we'll keep with the Google Photos example, grouping people, right? So it's kind of a face recognition where the Google programmers do not know, or the data where the function is trained on doesn't have these people, but when it runs on our system, right, it looks through our photos and groups in by faces. So every time we press on a face, we can see all the photos that this person appeared in.
Yeah,
so
and then it asks you, right? It gives you two pictures, and it's like, is this XYZ person? Yes, no, or maybe. And like sometimes I don't know. I'm like because it's a picture of an adult and the child version of that person, and you're like, I don't know if that's the same person, but it collects. The point is, it collects data from the user.
Exactly. So today, my Google app just notified me and asked me about two people, two faces. Actually, it's the same person, my father-in-law, and he asked me, is that the same person? And one was just straightforward, and one was from the side looking. And it's really interesting how the model that it found some high similarity, but it wasn't sure it's the same, so could iteratively retrain itself, right? When I said, yeah, merge these groups. So this is a really good example. So going back to our machine learning, so after we discussed a bit what is it, we can now apply a machine learning algorithm to identify threats in our organization, right? And let's put in mind that the desired output is a function that maps new data from our organization, unseen input, right, to a MITRE threat, the group of threats that Roi just demonstrated. And let's ask ourselves, what are the steps for that? So the first would be to collect data, right? Then we would like to turn this data into an input for our model, meaning to pre-process it into features. Features are the input variables of our model, and select those that we would like to train our model with. And of course, at the end, to train and evaluate our model. This is an iterative process. And just before we start speaking about what data sources can we collect, I feel that it's really important to mention that the most important stage of a good model training is the data that is collected and the pre-processing of it. And therefore, it's really important to put time and effort into it, because the accuracy of a model is based on the training data. So Paul, what data should we collect in order to identify threats? What do you think?
Certainly not garbage, because garbage in, garbage out, I believe, is the analogy an analogy to describe what you were just talking about. But the data that we want to input is that spreadsheet, right, that you showed earlier, and import those fields.
Yeah, but I have another idea. Let's see what you think. What about like kind of vendors' market share? Do you think it impact the threat, right?
Oh, I'm gonna go with the CVE.
Yeah, CVE is just something similar, right? We can think about how to add some information that are not just cyber related, but could really impact our model, right? I'll give you some example. For example, what do you think about exploits of older versions of the same application that have some input about future threats?
Right. The age of the vulnerability, for example.
Right.
So there are things that we all know. Again, the age of the vulnerability, the CV, the description, the things of the exploit DB. But if I would introduce you to two applications, and we're not mentioning the vendors, but you have like a bigger vendor which we all know that are frequently being hacked, and we are every Tuesday need to spend time around. And you have some vendor which is a bit less known. So because you as a human being, you know that this one vendor is far more known than other, you can make this assumption. But when you introduce this data point to a machine, you need to find like pseudo algorithms which can generate the same result. So one idea or one feature you can introduce to a model in potential is market share. Or for instance, It could be crazy, but Twitter followers. So you're going to inspect the followers for a given company, or even the YouTube likes for a given company. And these things in potential could be introduced to a model to predict whether something will become a threat, aside of the CVEs. So when you become, you have a lot of data points, a lot of pieces of information. This is where a model is required.
Roy, your answer was way better than mine. Thank you.
So I had a question, Roy.
Is it market share or install base?
So some of the things eventually, when you're trying to generalize the data, right? So some of the things are not necessarily available. Market share, for example, it's easier to collect. It's either the company is traded somewhere with the known stock exchange, or it's a private held, and you have multiple data points or data sources like Crunchbase or even going to the Nasdaq or the Dun and the Bernstein, you got a lot of data points where you can basically create a generalized, well-formatted data point and relate to that. So install base, it's a great feature, but again, you need to collect it in a way that will be, let's call it scalable. But it's a good point. It could be a great feature if you're gonna collect that.
Right, and just to relate to what you're saying, Roy, so because the machine learning, we have a much higher computational ability, it's really nice to add all kind of features that if we would have to manually analyze the data, we can, use them all. So that's really exciting. And let's go back to our data. So now that we collected, we need to turn it into features, right? Features are the input variables of our model. So if we'll be looking at all this information, some features can be generated, directly from our data. Some could be generated by applying basic algorithms. For example, how often an app is used, or what is the percentage of assets that the app is installed on, and so on and so on. And another method for generating features could be applying machine learning algorithms, kind of a sub-research that for a big model, that their output would be an input for a big model. And by applying the machine learning algorithms, we can predict new information. And a good example for that would be predicting the likelihood of a vulnerability to be exploited if it doesn't have an exploit yet, or when would it be available, the exploit. Another good example could be analyzing CV description and receiving information about the attack or the impact in case of a successful exploit. We can analyze automatically the vulnerability vector and so on and so on. And I believe that, with all these methods, we can generate a diverse feature collection of information about vulnerabilities in 0 days and have include some about the risk, about the usage, about some possible treatments. And we can even add some of the user's taste, for example, which threats did the user choose to treat in the past. And, we might end up with a really high number of features, and that also could be a disadvantage. Why? Because we might be needed to deal with computational cost, with poor performance of our model, or with overfitting training data, meaning that our output function is not generalized enough, and we'll have a high rate of mistakes over new inputs. So what can we do? How can we lower the number of features, but in a smart process? So we can. This is called actually a dimensional
I'm glad.
reduction.
I thought you were going to call on me again, Shani. I'm glad you didn't.
No worries. Yeah. So there's this method of feature selection, and there's different algorithms that helps us to do it to reduce our dimension. For example, the lasso regression, and what these methods do is help us to select features that are most useful or most informative for our model. And now we get to the most exciting part, where after we collected the data and processed it into input variables, we can finally start training. So if we'll go back to our nice image of the machine learning, right? So what we would like to do here is to choose a supervised learning to solve a classification problem, right? Our problem is, of course, training a function that, using new data, will classify it to a MITRE threat, one of those that we are treating with a patch or patchless protection. And how will we do that? We will want to feed our model with these features that we just collected and selected and receive a function that when a new data appears will decide whether it is a thread and of which family. Right, so Roi, can you please share us some of the threats our model found?
Yeah, obviously. So, of course, what we're going to show, it's still work in progress. But basically what you see here is a result of such a potential prediction. For instance, we got here one of these techniques we cover through the MITRE ATT&CK framework, where there is a set of properties which you can see and you can really understand, which resulted in a potential exploit for a public-facing application which is communicating with the internet and is out there. So in any case, what we want to achieve here by applying these models is to take a group of let's call it neurons or features, and with doing these manipulations, we want to result a potential threat where a client can really understand. And let's go again back a bit and understand why it is so important. So I will share again our dashboard, and as you can see here, if you recall, the way that we prioritize vulnerabilities is based on the tags. We are basically tagging data points, and according to that, we apply some risk factors to determine what of the applications are susceptible for an attack or more likely to be hijacked or whatsoever.
And
now,
sorry,
when it
Roi,
comes to,
for our audience especially, and especially those listening, when you're looking at these tags, are those discovered and applied automatically by Vicarius or by Topia, I should say, or is the human applying those, or is it a combination of both?
So these tags are all generated automatically upon deployment of the system. These tags are basically are a result of threat intelligence. So we basically correlate a few feeds. And if there is a matching vulnerability or a matching application that answers some of these feeds, obviously we're going to tag them. So the customer or the client doesn't need to go and to browse through the internet and to try to figure out which of the applications are talked about or in potential, already have been weaponized.
But it's also taking into account the environmental data as well, in terms of, well, if it's Firefox and it has an exploit and you've tagged it with a couple of things, you can say Firefox is the most used application in your environment and blend that together automatically without me having to do anything but put the agent and set this up, right?
Precisely, Paul, precisely. And this is kind of also correlate back to the session where we discussed about the prioritization part, where, every vulnerability got the vector. What we do here is basically we validate that so that the properties of the given vulnerability are being met on the customer side. And upon such, it's something that is more likely or more feasible to be exploited, unlike things that, for instance, require high privileges or some network configuration in order for them to be abused. So definitely it's a good point at which you've raised. We are correlating external feeds and internal feeds. And as I said, looking beyond the horizon, here we got about, I would like to say 20 or 30 tags. In the future, where we're going to have hundreds or thousands of these, again, it will become something that a person will be finding in potential hard to correlate. Because again, clicking here, this is something the system does automatically. For instance, which of my applications are exploitable, in use, and are communicating with each other. It's very easy to grasp the threat and to take action. But when it comes to a lot of potential tags and a lot of potential threats, it's something that a human may struggle in potential. But of course, again, the fact that we are basically showing the user what are the threats on a nice graph where you can see what exactly contributes to the risk, it's something that we see of high value and high necessity. Because imagine, Paul, if we would have told the client, look, you should trust us because we have like a super sophisticated data, machine learning algorithm which does this calculation. It's very hard in some cases to leverage this in potential, or even get, if you get security teams and IT teams, sometimes because of this dissonance, or they're trying to pull different directions, it's hard to get them engaged and to remediate things. And when all teams see exactly what is out there and how it could be in potential be exploited or hijacked, this is something that we see of great value. So again, here we got only a few of these, and you can see how they contribute to the risk. Imagine again in the future we're going to have hundreds or thousands. This is something that, of course, a model needs to do the prediction. So this is how we are basically trying to harness the power of algorithms and machine learning in order to better predict multiple things. Some of the tags, well, today most of the tags you see here are a result of coding. There is no algorithm who generates that, but like Shani mentioned, there are now work in progress like algorithms who are going to predict, for instance, if something doesn't have an exploit today, but in future it will have. We are now applying some supervised models to create these tags. So it's going to be exciting both on the tags side of things, because some of them will be, again, are generated by humans, meaning a person writes the code, but also others are being generated by machines. Again, whether something will be exploitable in the future, this is one thing. The likelihood for weaponization, which there is already a data set that can represent that, that's another thing. So eventually, if you have the right data, you can also harness this to do amazing things, predicting what will be exploited in any given environment. And also another cool feature we are adding is the option to customize. If we revert back to the example of Google Images, where it asks you, hey, Paul, this is a person you say yes or no. So imagine you would personalize the threat also to your company, where the algorithm is going to introduce you, look, Paul, is that a threat you think it's worthy of your time and it's related to, I don't know, data theft or credentials theft, and you're going to say yes or no. So the model going to reprocess the things based on the weights or the inputs you just provided. So as I said, there are exciting things in the field of data science in connection to vulnerabilities. This is definitely one of the key projects for the company for the upcoming releases.
That's really cool. I have a feature request, though. If you want to monitor the dark web chat communications and then funnel that into natural language processing and apply tags based on that, that'd be awesome.
Actually, it already happens. Maybe
does it really?
Not to the full extent.
That wouldn't surprise me. Yeah.
When we process the CV description.
I was going to ask you apply that to the CVE description, right?
Yeah. So this is already being done today. So we process the CV description, and according to that, we can tag a few things. Some of them are more simple, some of them are more complex. But yeah, definitely the CV description is something that we consider, that we definitely use. And all the the advisory links, when you scrape that and you basically process that. So obviously these are things that are of great value to predict potential impact.
Absolutely. Lee.
So I was just wondering about, how about if I, incorporated like checking for my stuff in Showdown to see about vulnerable things like it, or actually I show up at the top of the list?
This is definitely something you can correlate back. This is a data point where not per se will tag that as something it in potential could be introduced to a model. But this is something that we have a lot of data feeds that we collect from, and some of them again are represented here. For instance, the simple ones are: is there an exploit, which it could be, the ones that we know and some that we know less. For example, ExploitDB is one example. Mm-hmm. Or Twitter, basically there's a Twitter API you can collect information from, and according to that you can correlate. So Showdown is definitely a feed that in potential could be introduced. We have now quite a lot in our bucket list of feeds now customers ask us to introduce, so we are working on it. And as we see the tags, the growth is exponential. It's really off the roof. There's a lot of tags which are now on the roadmap. Again, as I said, some of them are coded, and others will be a result of an algorithm generating them.
Do the customers have the ability to input their own private feeds, or set that up so that if it was not a feed that you guys are going to integrate, is there an option to bring in other feeds that are going to be private?
Definitely. There is also it's something we haven't covered that, but there is an API which you can introduce feeds into, and definitely we can generate tags of. Also, getting back to the example of the threat, the threats that we cover, As we said, these are being generated by machine, but we also want to give customer an option to take a few tags and to create his own like threat. For instance, I want to create a group of all of my applications that are, again, got an exploit, for instance, have been weaponized in the past, are internet facing and running on a sensitive server. So all of that, these tags could result, let's call it a simple threat. What we're trying to also to discuss about is that there will be threats who are going to be compound of maybe tens or maybe hundreds of tags, which again, a human would be finding hard to create. But definitely it's something which is customizable. And some of the tags you see here are things that in potential you would like to adjust, both in the sense of the weights, and now you can really create your own risk model, because company A can say, if there is an expert for me, it's a red flag, it's a no-go. And then I want to weight it far higher than others. Another company would like to say, my sensitive servers, this is the top priority. So I want to tag these vulnerabilities and these assets as something that is more like, more susceptible for an attack or more risky. But again, these are simple models. What we are trying to talk about here is that we're going to introduce something which is a bit more complex and going to collect a lot of data points altogether.
I mean, is it as simple as taking a lot of the guesswork out of your remediation?
Hopefully. Well, we try to make it simple. And the fact we are not using, let's call it, at least for now, we're not using deep learning or neural networks where there is a hidden layer. And then it's very hard to understand what resulted the threat. When you have a model which is compound of multiple layers, which are not necessarily are easy to explain, sometimes you may find it hard to really dig into why it is a problem for me. So as long as we can, we try to keep it simple and try to, at least to some extent, show the different features who contributed for a given threat.
Is there a point where you get too many feeds or bad feeds? I mean, it seems like you could wind up going over the top and actually making negative progress on what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, so this is like Shani said, it's the data is all about it. Trying not to collect too many data, to things that in potential may damage your model. So definitely, this is something that we need to look up to and to make sure we are not just spamming the model with feeds which don't provide any value.
Roy,
and also,
ahead,
also I want to add to Roy's explanation. It's also okay to add more data that we need, because then we can apply those algorithms of feature selection and reduce the number of data that we use at the end in order to train our model. So it's good to add more data at first and then, smartly reduce it.
I get this. I think this is really awesome. My question is, how do we explain this to some of our other team members and or managers and convince them that this is the vulnerabilities we need to fix first, because it's right here, because it's machine learning and supervised learning, and they're not going to get that right. How do we break it down for them?
Because Shani and Roy said so.
Yeah, I'd buy that.
Yeah, again, the fact that this algorithm is not a black box, and to some extent you can see inside and what contributed to a certain output. Again, for instance, this is a critical vulnerability because of, and let's simplify that. There is an exploit. It has been weaponized. A company like us got breached the other day, and there is a sensitive server. So all of these are data points in the model. Now take that, and you can of course elaborate that, but you have a story here. You can go to your manager and tell them, this is why we need to prioritize this, and that, and not, again, as we discussed a few sessions ago, everything above CVSS 8 is a fix. And then you see there are too many, you say, okay, 9.5, and try to raise the bar up until you can cope with the numbers.
Right. Yeah, because I think that management really understands when I go to them and say, we're going to look at all of our vulnerabilities, discover them, and anything that's a CVSS score of 7.0 or greater, we're going to fix within 5 business days, right? And they go, yeah, we like everyone feels good. And for a whole host of reasons, that's a really terrible strategy, right? I want to go to management and say, look, we've got a system that takes into more factors than any human can compute in their brains, and looks into that and says, this is really where we need to be focusing our efforts. Is that more of like the conversation that you want to have?
Yeah, precisely. We're trying to divert the conversation, and this is a true story where the board basically fights the chief information security officer about why you didn't patch the 7-zip, and he tries to explain, this is not what's important, really, guys. We should be looking somewhere else. When they say, no, this is something which it says critical here. This is a problem. He tried to persuade them. So obviously the discussion needs to be shifted from, something which, again, to a human brain, it's easy to understand, but we need to make it things which are more, make more rational and more making sense to the given company unique risk factors.
Jeff.
I want to pose your question slightly differently. It's essentially what Paul just asked you, but I'm throwing in a PCI question for you. Customers that are subject to PCI, they're allowed to prioritize their vulnerabilities, whether they know it or not, but they're supposed to do it based on a pre-described or predefined risk ranking criteria. So my question is, how can you guys help companies write up their risk ranking criteria, which ultimately will satisfy, I think, board members, to Paul's point, but more importantly, how do you satisfy the assessors and the auditors that come in and say, oh my gosh, there's all these 7.0 findings, why haven't you fixed them? Well, we have this document here that explains in somewhat detail, but also human readable, human understandable. Here's how we're approaching looking at vulnerabilities to determine their risk to our environment. Have you given any thought to that? Beyond what you were describing to Paul.
I'm disappointed. We only get to drink twice because Jeff only said PCI twice. I guess that means I said it anyway. Sorry, continue, Roy.
I think it's a great question, and I will separate my answer to two parts. First of all, I think regulation and PCI, it's the third time, needs to be advancing with technology. For instance, I will give the example of virtual patching, or we call it patches protection. But the virtual patching concept is out there. It exists. It's a thing, and it's not something, at least as far as I know, a box you can tick on your regulation that needs that asks you to patch something in a given period. And obviously there is a difference between what regulation dictates us and where the technology is at. So we hope that in turns the regulation could understand that a company can define its own risk factors, unless they say we don't have any idea how it works, and they can comply with the existing ones as standards requires. But we hope the technology will advance and allow a company to take advantage of new techniques like virtual patching and patches protection or new risk models. That being said, again, we can customize the risk model according to a given company's requirements. So yeah, we bring the tools, we bring you the latest tech, but eventually it's up to you if you're going to use it or not. So you can adjust the weights according to your, something that would be PCI compliant, and do it, by the book. Not necessarily the most relevant to a given company's risk factors, but it will satisfy some regulation. So we can comply with the past or look to the future. There are two options.
That was very prolific, Roy. I like that.
Yeah.
And yet very unsatisfying. Let me restate the question a little bit, because you responded by bringing up patch management, which ironically the patch management requirement in PCI is immediately after the requirement to come up with your own risk ranking criteria. So even the patching within PCI is supposed to be based on risk ranking criteria, which PCI allows you to do. I guess what I'm looking for is less of an automated technology response, but a way to describe it in a document so that somebody can read it, even if it's just got pictures, but can accept the fact that your technology is doing all sorts of different things. But can you say what that is on a piece of paper in a relatively terse manner, so that humans can, and not necessarily practitioners can absorb it, can consume it.
So that's saying like PCI auditors need to have things described in pictures rather than words in the books they read.
I think most people would rather have things described in pictures rather than words. Like, people that are trying to imagine the apparatus that Tyler's attached himself to right now that aren't watching the video. Mm-hmm. The imagination just goes wild. Mm. But the point I'm trying to make is, you're not just having to sell management or the executive suite. You also have to sell the auditors and the assessors that are going to come in and bless this from a compliance perspective.
Yeah. So in terms of explaining why a given vulnerability or a given application or a given thing is something that worthy of your time, this is the best way, at least we came up with, basically explaining you why something requires of your time. So the different factors are easily shown, unlike, for instance, a full feed of CVEs where you're trying to understand whether something is applicable or not. So the way that we do that, we basically attach different factors, as you can see here. And of course, it's all things you can generate and show the auditor, look, there is an exploit here, and therefore it's something that is worthy of our time, or it's a new vulnerability, people are tweeting about it, there are predicted threats here, and this is why we need to take an action. Unlike things which are in low risk and in potential may not necessarily needed to be applied. So this is kind of how we can illustrate an auditor what or why something is worthy of his time. And again, keep in mind, these weights are something which are adjustable. So a given company can define their own weights, their own criteria, and adjust the risk factors according to their own security policy. So getting back to your question, how can you justify an auditor whether something is actually at risk, even though, or not at risk, even though there is a high or critical vulnerability? We are using the tags mechanism in order to achieve that, and hope it answers your question.
The old way is flawed because it doesn't take into account all of those data points. This way does. I think if you could also provide, if it were me, I would provide the auditor with documentation on, here's the methodology we use, and here's how we've tuned it to our environment to derive, these particular scores or priorities that we're taking action on, Jeff, right? So maybe it's not necessarily like Roy and Vicarius's responsibility to do that, but if I were the customer and you were the auditor, if we could take on those roles, I would say, here's our methodology for adjusting the priorities and severities of the vulnerabilities that we face. Here's how we've kind of tuned and modified the model, and here's why.
Well, I want to add to that. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I want to just add to that not only the apps we have this risk explanation, but also in the machine learning model that we shared earlier, all those threats that the model identified, it's not a black box. For each threat that was identified, there's some of the features that the model used in order to decide that is a threat. Roy, can you share with us that screen again, please?
Sure. And there we go.
No, not that screen, the live threat screen, please.
Yeah, that one's basically your results, right?
Yeah, so even here, it's not a black box. We want the security team to understand why is that a threat, and to retrain the model if they believe that's not a threat, or it's not a threat that they want to treat. So it's not a deep learning model where everything is unknown and we can understand what happened. It's a model where it is understandable, and the features that were used in order to decide that it's a threat, or at least some of them, are presented here.
So, I want to give my little marketing pitch to you guys. Paul, they're not obligated to explain it. It's a sales opportunity. There are over 5,000 companies that are listed on the Visa Global Service Provider listing. Service providers always have to do the full PCI DSS, and then even the larger enterprise size merchants is also probably in the pushing 10,000 companies in North America right now. You guys are offering a way for companies to tailor their risk ranking. Everybody else that I've talked to that is tackling this prioritization thing this year has their own way of rolling it that they push out. And what I've asked each one of them is, how do you let the customers choose? How do you let the customers set the thresholds, set the variables, set the criteria? And they all kind of fumble over that. You don't. You have an immediate response. So nudge, nudge, wink, wink. There's a huge market out there for people that would love to do this, because vulnerability remediation is the bane of most companies that have to do PCI. Just like everybody else, they hate having to go through the hundreds and thousands of vulnerabilities. Give them a way to cut down to what's real and what's most relevant. You will have a customer for life. I'll rest there.
No, Jeff, I think it's sound advice, and I think that the ability to do that and have insight into that process is huge. It's huge, because as we've already shown on previous episodes with Shani and Roy, it can be highly subjective, right? And we've also shown that one particular public data point, like a CVSS score, is also flawed in so many ways. All that kind of leads up to, I think, what Roy and Shani showed us tonight, was that this can all be seemingly automated. I don't know if that's the right word, right? But this data can be aggregated by software rather than humans to help us make better decisions, is really what we're after. I mean, compliance may one thing, but ultimately, in my opinion, this helps us make better decisions.
Would agree.
Sweet. Questions, comments from anyone else? Roy, is this a newer feature that you're rolling out? Is that?
Yeah, this is will be rolled out in the future release, and we are now Michael is going to have a session about the upcoming feature. Will not still is thunder, but definitely we're going to introduce a lot more models and a lot more machine-driven insights and threats in the near future. So definitely stay tuned.
I was curious
around
your subscription or pricing model. Like how does and maybe you've covered this on a previous episode, but how does your kind of structure work from a purchasing side?
It's per asset, basically, because what we're trying to do here is to bridge the gap between the scanning, finding the issues, make the decision, and fixing them. So it's all per asset, per node, you can call it. And this is how it's being priced. Basically, any device we're going to provide you value for.
In your current platform support?
So we support Windows, Linux, and Mac.
Oh, so you support Linux now too?
Yeah, we got the full coverage. Also for the cool features like the patches.
So, you lived up to your word. You just said you would have that for the end of the year. That's awesome.
Want to ruin them all.
I'm excited.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, Roy and Shani, thank you so much for appearing on Paul Security Weekly this evening.
Thanks,
it's been a pleasure
for having us. It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Always nice having you both. For folks that want to learn more, make sure you visit securityweekly.com/Vicarius. Coming up next, Harry Sverdlove from ZScaler. Stick around. PlexTrack is the platform that helps cybersecurity practitioners get the daily work done. Red teams can create reports in half the time and track risk to resolution with the blue team. Teams can centralize remediation efforts across all scans, assessments, and audits. Effectively communicate risk in real time through simple visualizations, scanner and ticketing integrations, and robust analytics. PlexTrack is perfect for collaboration across all teams. Visit securityweekly.com/PlexTrack to claim your free month. Hackers attack systems that are not patched. You need protection, but virtual patching isn't working. That's why you go patchless. Topia analyzes, prioritizes, and remediates vulnerabilities before they're exploited. Even the 0 days, all from one interface. Security gets better memory defense to complement endpoint strategy while improving overall vulnerability management and compliance. Adopt a hacker's mindset, eliminate vulnerability. Get your 30-day free trial at securityweekly.com/Vicarius. Are you an enterprise dissatisfied with overpriced analytics software that can't keep up with modern data? If so, then GravWell is the solution for you. GravWell is an unstructured data analytics platform for enterprises who demand total data visibility across their network. GravWell lets your security team go beyond the SIM and fuse data sources to correlate and answer questions you didn't know needed to be asked. Go to gravwell.io/securityweekly for an unlimited data trial and gain uncompromising visibility today. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. Do you have a specific guest or topic that you'd like us to cover on one of the upcoming shows? Well, we've got the sheet ready for that guest. Submit your guest suggestions by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and complete the form. We will review those suggestions monthly and reach out once they are reviewed. I was, of course, joking about the sheet. It was just the way I was reading the teleprompter. This segment is sponsored by Edgewise. Visit securityweekly.com/Edgewise to learn more. Joining us for this segment, Harry Sverdlove, the chief technologist at ZScaler. Harry joins us tonight for a segment on the topic, which is very timely. I'm told there was a SolarWinds breach. Securing the enterprise software supply chain. Harry, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Paul. Glad to be here, and I guess a little clarification. Formerly Edgewise, now part of the ZScaler family.
Did I read that as, and maybe that was Burgundy reads what's on the teleprompter. So
it was the slide up there. I mean, you read it right.
I gotcha. Yes, now ZScaler. It's still doing the same feature set and product, right? Moved to ZScaler.
Yes,
correct,
but it's it's important. It has a new acronym, so everything needs new TLAs. So it's actually Zscaler Workload Segmentation, gotcha. ZWS. But it is still this same functionality, same business, same product.
Awesome, outstanding. Harry, you and I were talking about this the SolarWinds breach. I had not read up on it very much when we were talking, but it was clear it was a supply chain attack was involved. There's lots of aspects to this story, but you and I started to focus on like supply chain attacks are a thing. And Tyler was just saying before the show, I'm like, well, NotPetya relied on one, right? But
NotPetya relied on Medox. What is it? The tax software.
Yep.
That was a supply chain attack. Flame wasn't a supply chain, but it relied on it. Well, at least it used a vulnerability in the Microsoft Update service, so it wasn't attacking Microsoft, but it did attack a flaw in their update server. So there's been a couple supply chain attacks that have been some pretty high profile.
And some of the articles I read said that these are very complicated and sophisticated attacks. That's not always the case when we talk about supply chain, right?
No, it's I think we get confused with sophisticated attackers versus sophisticated attacks.
Yeah.
A lot of these attacks are, if you will, or at least involve the original infiltrations as low tech, I don't think the details are released, for example, in SolarWinds, exactly how their update server got compromised. But I did read that a year ago, it was, a white hat hacker had reported that he could access the update server with the password SolarWinds123. That's not very sophisticated. But the subsequent stages and staying stealth like they did, those techniques I think were sophisticated. But I think in most cases, when we say it's an advanced or sophisticated attack, we really mean the attacker more than the techniques. And
I also think we have to reference the different groups that may have been involved in this attack. I think we tend to lose sight of, especially when you read the media, news articles on this subject, that there may be different levels of sophistication associated with various groups, and one group may go, I've got the SolarWinds update servers, like, you want access, you pay me some money. They give it to maybe in a more or less sophisticated group that then gains a foothold and maybe sells off that access to someone else. It's at a different level of sophistication, right? This isn't all just 0 or 1 kind of thing.
Well, and that's true, but that's even true with even when the actor is just state-sponsored. And we've seen this a lot with Chinese state-sponsored attacks, where there are different teams, sort of their A team, their B team, their C team, and their outsourced team, just like any other company. And so they might do an infiltration with their high-tech team, or the A team, and then pass it off to, hey, we got we've got 10,000 systems compromised. Let's hand it off to the B team to grab the passwords. Or might be the opposite. The B team found their way in. Let's hand it off to the A team because this is a high-value target. So there's no question that even within, if you will, attacker campaigns, there's different teams with different levels of sophistication, just like at a company, any other company.
Right. I can just imagine the conversation in Russian where they're like, yeah, we've been in this company for so long. I won't even try a Russian accent. We've been in this company so long. We got what we needed. Like, let's hand it off to the newer teams and just see what they do with it, right? And maybe they can learn something. And if they burn all of our stuff, like, whatever, we were going to burn it anyway, right?
Well, you have to also look at it from that other team. They're probably thinking, hey, this is my chance to move up into the A team.
Right.
If I show my boss I'm doing really well. Now, of course, I won't try to feign a Russian accent, but I can give you my one Russian. I can say, "Я не знаю ничего." It means I don't know anything.
I thought you were going to say that I am the machine is what that means.
I am the machine. That's the best skit ever. And not enough people get that reference.
Right.
Oh my gosh. That is such a great skit.
We digress. That's awesome. But so we were talking about in the context of also, and pen testers, former pen testers in the room. Was it Seagate's backup exec? Is that who owned backup exec? I feel like it transferred around a little bit, but it was Seagate backup exec, right? And that agent, they had a massive footprint in the enterprise. And it was a glorious day when you got on the internal network and you're like, oh, sweet. They're running backup exec. That means at least like a certain percentage, even if they'd updated, there was always that like small percentage, sometimes, usually a large percentage, that were vulnerable to some heinous remote code execution that was ridiculously easy.
Yeah. This wasn't a supply chain one, but I remember, gosh, what was it? In the early days of Sony, their DRM that they'd install on surreptitiously install on systems, and they wanted to hide their own DRM. So basically, it would hide any file in Windows system that matched a very specific file name. So it wasn't a supply chain, but attackers realized, hey, all I have to do is name my file this, put it in the system directory, and if they've got this Sony DRM CD, they'll never see me.
Right. Yeah, and I'm wondering if attacks such as these that are going after the software update mechanism, I'm wondering if that's largely because while email phishing is wildly successful, it's still kind of noisy. In other words, I can really slip in unnoticed if I can compromise an update server, although it's not as much of a targeted attack necessarily.
Well, if you can take, and this is one of the challenges when we talk about supply chain attacks, everybody out there with their software now in the World Wide Web, they have update servers, they automatically push out updates, and they think to themselves, oh, I'm going to set out this update server, make it accessible to the entire internet because I want all my clients to be able to get it. And I'm only putting good stuff there anyway, so it's okay. And they don't think about that as a security vector. It's a nasty problem. And if you're going to have an update server, which most people are going to have one, you have to look at that from a threat vector perspective. And I've seen this with, we see this is obviously the entry point for the Orion compromise, but we've seen similar problems with digital phone systems, with other things where they don't think about they think, oh, is my product secure, or I'm testing it, or I'm going through my SDLC. But what happens at the final stage when it goes out there? Can anybody get on the update server? Yep. Can anybody push something out?
Harry, you reminded me, Microsoft suffered from this attack, and likely one reason why the largest software company in the world can go, hey, we can fix this attack. We've got the talent and the people and the means to do it. And largely they have done a fantastic job, except for that one time.
Yeah, but actually, and they've helped out here. I think Microsoft has taken over at least one, if not multiple, of the SolarWinds command and control domains. So, and they're working with government agencies, I assume, to at least try to halt the infection, if not trigger a kill switch and identify who may be impacted.
Right.
So, I had a question. We talked about, easily accessing their update source. Why would I think they only got the one that's been identified? Why wouldn't I think they've got all of them? Because wouldn't they do equally bad security everywhere? Or am I just being tinfoil hat?
You mean SolarWinds update server?
Yeah. Why wouldn't I assume they got all their products?
The way that their one works is very specific, and this is something that we do a lot from like a red team standpoint, right? The sideloading of DLLs and using that signed binary. This is basically that technique. Now, the fact that they did it to a build server, knowing that certain companies are going to pull those updates, that's where it gets kind of interesting. Like, is all of this smoke and mirrors, and there's a back campaign going with different infrastructure, or was this highly targeted? Because there was a very interesting sequence of events that unfolded in a single week with some very high value targets as this was coming out. And so I still think there's some smoke and mirrors there, but there's also some very organized and objective frame of mind people attacking these. Like, this has some serious implications. It was well organized and hit very fast and hard.
Yeah, no, there's no question about that. And I think you're spot on. There is a little bit of smoke and mirrors. Could other things have been affected? If they did get control or were able to infiltrate one build server, would they have done more? But the other side of the coin is SolarWinds was just a stepping stone for them. They obviously had a set of targets, or a multiple set of targets, and by attacking the supply chain, they aren't interested necessarily in what SolarWinds has. They're interested in SolarWinds customers. So is it possible it is simply the Orion software that was infected? Yes. Is it possible that SolarWinds needs to do a deep cleanse of, or at least a review of everything and all of their systems? Absolutely.
Yep. And Harry, this becomes an interesting...
Sorry,
Larry,
Tyler. Then Tyler.
Yeah, so Harry, this one becomes an interesting one when we start looking into the SolarWinds stuff and who allegedly was compromised based on those randomly generated URLs in the AVS cloud domain, and reversing those hashes. There are two companies that are now coming out to say that one has said just recently, within the last couple hours, has said that they may have been compromised by it, and another one whose domain shows up there. And we now may be looking into a supply chain attack that led to an attack for another organization to allow for additional supply chain attacks. And those two companies are Microsoft and Cisco.
I think we're going to hear a lot of layers of the onion are going to get peeled over the next several months. In fact,
I just Harry, I can't wait till the book comes out, because I got a feeling this is big enough to warrant a book.
It's time for another movie. Look, ever since Hackers in the 80s, we need something new now. Not to make light of the situation.
Oh God, he had to go there.
I know, you had to mention the best hacker movie in the world.
But you said 80s. Hackers came out in
95,
what year?
95. 25-year anniversary.
War Games was 83. Sneakers was 92. Hackers was 95.
And back to Tyler.
I stand absolutely corrected. You're right. Would you like to play a game?
Tyler, I think Tyler would. Tyler.
I think one thing we're going to have to kind of be cognizant of and think about moving forward is SolarWinds was a stepping stone, and there's a very clear campaign and objective here that is being executed very efficiently. So what other software vendors, like, are you one of the other vendors, or for other actors, this should be a wake-up call to a lot of the software vendors, like, get your stuff in order, because say something like, I don't know, one of the VPN services or a remote desktop service, BombGuard, any of these services that are widespread within inside of enterprises that provide some interesting access, they've always been targets, but this is just a proof that, hey, these targets are going to be leveraged, and when that happens, it's going to happen quickly, and it's going to be pretty devastating if you're not prepared for good remediation, good IR response, have a good disaster plan. Like, all of those things are going to come into play for SolarWinds, and you've seen how bad this could be a devastating blow to a company.
But Tyler, what you're also alluding to is, as an enterprise, what do we trust? Who do we trust? Do we Obviously, a lot of people, right?
I think that's part of that.
I was throwing you a softball there, Harry.
No, I think that's exactly right. Because look, you're both right. Obviously, all software vendors need to look at their own practices, their own SDLC, their own infrastructure, and not only consider their own security situation, but what is their incident response plan. That said, at the end of the day, I'm not a big fan of throwing other companies under the bus type of thing. Everybody gets hacked. It happens, sophisticated, not sophisticated. It's going to happen. And so the question is, what do consumers, what is the customers, how should they be planning? How do you bring in new technology? How do you bring in, it's the same as, look, it is not a different problem than when you're hiring third-party contractors and third-party vendors and you're bringing them into your buildings and they have temporary access badges and they're walking around freely. How do you secure your property but still allow third parties? This is a little more complicated because this is the digital world. How do you bring in third party technologies? And they are ubiquitous and you can't live without them. So how do we bring those in and yet still keep them isolated from anything that they don't need to do their job? And I think that really is sort of, this is obviously where ZScaler and why the Edgewise and ZScaler marriage makes so much sense. That is the zero trust model, which is you assume everybody is breached. You assume every person is potentially infected. You assume every system. You assume every third party tech is potentially breached or at least breached. How do you deploy that now? How do you deploy that in your organization?
Back in the old school days of Unix, and to a certain extent Linux, we used to run processes in cheroot jails because we didn't trust the process. We wanted to limit its access. And how do you do that when you've got something like SolarWinds or Backup Exec or some kind of agent, let's say on a Windows system that you're trying to trust? I think other than certain products such as yours, Harry, right? We struggle to get there, right?
Right. No, sales pitch aside, obviously that is what Zscaler workload segmentation is about, is helping do that. But when you're dealing with software that, like backup software, that by definition is going to have access to every system, every file, even protected files, because that's its job. How do you make sure, in that case, what kind of requirements do you place on your vendors to make sure that at least they've thought through the problem? I mean, step one is first find out, have they even thought through the problem? Do they have a plan? Do they have a security posture? Do they have, whether it's accreditation or other types of things that at least show? I'm not saying that any accreditations give you the kiss of safety. I'm saying it at least shows your thinking. That's a starting question. And have that conversation with your vendors, because again, when you can't deploy a backup software and say, but it can't access any of my systems. You can't deploy a SolarWinds Orion and say, I want to monitor my network performance and reroute and infrastructure improvements, but actually don't access my network. But
that's a great point. And we've covered a lot of third-party vendor risk, right? But in this context, I find it very interesting that there's a scale that we can start weeding out maybe some potential vendors. If they have not considered security and can't answer basic questions, that's different. I'm not saying you don't choose that software, right? It's one part of the criteria. And then there's other vendors that really have thought about it. And there's a way to measure that and, survey that. And that's one thing. But the other thing that I like is, I think, to get all of us collectively to a higher degree of security, we need to be able to scrutinize each other and say, well, if I'm going to partner with you, I'm going to buy your technology or use your services, I would need to see some type of security report, activity, survey, compliance, whatever it might be, before we can do business. And the companies that don't have that are going to go, oh, we really need that, right? I really think that every company has kind of this point where they've taken security somewhat seriously enough up until a point where you're not going to grow as a business or get new customers until you're forced to have that security. And it's not the best answer, but I think that helps.
And look, having been in companies in all sizes and stages, it's obviously always a challenge. When you're a startup, if you don't have functionality, you don't have customers.
Right.
You need to have customers first, but then, so you're not thinking security, although you should be. And then it always ends up becoming this afterthought in a lot of startup companies. And then all of a sudden they get too big, and in many cases it might be too late. They need to have that conversation even starting, but it's a tough challenge, right? If you're trying to build something new for the world, improve something, and you have to be thinking at the same time about the things that aren't going to gain you any revenue, which is, what about if somebody compromises it? What are the threat vectors of what I'm offering?
Absolutely.
I think getting the business units though to buy into that, like security has traditionally been its own department. It's got its own budget, and everything security related has to come out of that budget. If you get the buy-in though, and start to think of this as a whole business, where each business unit is affected by security, so that buy-in needs to be dispersed across larger asset groups or larger groups, so that everybody is participating, everybody's budgets reflect, and that kind of team mindset from the business down all correlates and is supported. The siloed security group and the siloed business unit of security, that model is not working as well.
Agreed.
It isn't, but not to be yet. Unfortunately, it's a little bit Pollyannish, because the reality is, I've seen that work. I've seen what you suggest work, and I'll tell you when I've seen it work. After a company has been breached, after they've been hit, and they're looking at an existential event, everybody's bought in. They believe it. They feel it. They now know to their core, this is important to the business. Until that happens, convincing people that security is important to their business is kind of like convincing people, don't eat the Oreo cookies. You really should just be eating, broccoli and healthy stuff.
The Russians would have had a much richer threat landscape if you buy into what Harry and Tyler just said, had they kept this quiet. Because now there's all these companies that have breaches, and based on what you two just said, their security is going to get way better.
The reality is, they didn't.
Target,
the attackers did try to keep it quiet. Right. Yeah. This was that's part of what made this sophisticated. Each attack, and FireEye is said as such, that they believe each target was manually controlled and had an attack plan specific tailored to that target. They kept it low. They kept the binary small. Even the command and control, most attacks you see with command and control, once they establish command and control, they encrypt the channel. They don't care. It's, they figure they could talk all day long. This obfuscated it using steganography and the commands embedded in standard looking XML files. They did everything they could to stay below the radar. And this came out only if I've put back this timeline, it was just first FireEye came out and said, hey, somebody has breached and taken some of our pen testing tools and our red team tools. And then very shortly thereafterwards, you see what the second stage of that, or the purpose of that was.
They got some cojones picking FireEye as a target, though.
Yeah, you've got to say that's right? you're taking the number one IR incident response team, at least certainly in notoriety around the world, and picking on them. That takes very big cojones.
Yep, Jeff.
But you know what? I'm depressed, because if it weren't for FireEye picking up on this activity, all the security technology that's out there today, all the compliance standards, regulatory standards, everything was missing it. Stop and think about that for a minute.
Yeah, I was kind of like, no, Jeff can't be depressed. Now I'm like, nope, I'm kind of depressed too.
Don't be sad.
Also, FireEye caught it. It sounded more like a process internal to FireEye that was responsible as kind of the first indicator.
Yeah, they caught some new device on the VPN that was in a weird place that they had enrolled in multi-factor. The other one that's also terrifying is you think about FireEye, quote, the world's largest incident responder, as it were. They're a great way to gain intelligences to whether or not you've been caught by determining what IR gigs that they're doing.
Yeah, juice is worth the squeeze.
Right.
Yeah, hell yeah.
Well, the other lesson here, and we knew this too, though, is the tools that the defenders use are the same tools that the attackers use. NotPetya, which had a variant of Mimikatz in it. Mimikatz was developed as a security pen testing sort of exercise.
And the Russians, if you remember the story of Mimikatz, the Russians were very interested in Mimikatz even before it was open sourced.
Yeah. And here again, the tools that were taken from FireEye. These are tools used for defensive purposes, but absolutely can be turned around and used for offensive. And I think this is also why, Paul, when you were talking earlier about, attacks could be in multiple stages and handed off. I'd look at it even another way. Attacks, the types of sophistication, when we are actually talking about sophisticated attacks, and there are pieces that are, that might be developed by the NSA, or vulnerabilities that might be developed by the NSA or by Russia or by the Chinese. Once those get out there, they trickle downstream. Those tools, those techniques, they become taxed and used by cybercrime. Right? Eternal Blue wasn't discovered and held onto so that ransomware attacks could be so prevalent. The cyber criminals got a hold of it, and then they used it for this. Same thing with most of these, and the techniques that we might see here. What are we going to do? The security research teams, we're publishing indicators. We're going to publish a lot more. I'm sure a lot more is going to be dissected about the Orion compromise, and the binaries are going to be published, and the details are going to be published, and then they're going to get sold on the dark web and commercialized, and then and then the cyber criminals will use them.
Harry, do you think was that to kind of level the playing fields, to kind of hurt the enemy being FireEye has these tools? If we compromise FireEye, maybe we've got some other objectives. But oh, by the way, don't forget, before we leave, make sure you take FireEye's tools that they developed and exploits and take those so we can make them public so they don't have them in their arsenal anymore.
Good question. I do go back. I can't speak to their motivation on why they targeted FireEye.
Right.
It could also be, as I understand it, they compromised FireEye through Orion, through the same SolarWinds hack. And it may be that, if I understand this correct, and I could be wrong, that if that's the timeline, it may be that, so there they were, they had compromised Orion, thinking, okay, we've got access now to a bunch of government agencies, commercial agencies they can pick. And one day one of the Russian hackers or whoever it might be came into work and said, holy crap, we're on FireEye's network.
Yeah.
And then in other words, it wasn't necessarily, hey, let's go get FireEye because we have an intention. It might have been opportunistic in that case, but I don't know.
You mentioned NSA, and I was going to save some of my NSA discussion for the news segment, but it seems like we're just talking about it now. We talked about this several weeks before. I forget what episode, Paul, but we were talking about cryptography and encryption. Well, I know I've brought it up before that, one of the principles when NSA was in the business of building encrypting cipher systems was to assume full knowledge of those systems was compromised. So if they were building a little black box that was going to do encryption, it was assumed that the adversary, who was primarily the Soviet Union back in those days, had gotten a copy, had gotten the specs, got the user's manual, they reverse engineered it, broken down, they knew everything about it, assume all that, make it secure. And in the commercial world, largely these days, when it comes to crypto and keeping things secure, there's a lot of proprietary solutions, and companies don't want to talk about what they're doing to keep things secure. And usually, in my experience, it's because they're not doing a whole lot, or they don't believe in what they're doing. But the ones that are even taking it seriously and trying to do things creatively and securely, they still don't like to talk about it. I keep chuckling, and this is not a laughing matter, but I keep thinking, what is happening right now is it's just good old-fashioned espionage, like back in the Cold War days, where one side figures out a way to be devastatingly effective against the other side, and oops, all of a sudden it's discovered. Only this time it's in the cyber world, it's in the digital world, and it's hugely public, and everybody's talking about it. But events like this have happened in our nation's past from a national security perspective. I just can't talk about most of them because they're classified. But it reminded me, and what I wanted to bring up, Paul, in the news segment is, and I know we were talking about this a couple weeks ago, or maybe it was a couple months ago, the IBM Selector 2 typewriters and the way the Russians had built the listening device into the bar, the roller bar. It's that type of thing. Devastating until it gets discovered, and then you're like, oh my gosh, they're everywhere.
I don't disagree. Look, Dick Clark, who used to be on the board of one of my earlier companies, used to say espionage is the second oldest profession. And what you said is totally true. But the difference is that if I'm sitting there listening to a typewriter, or what do they call that thing? You were saying that the keyboard part. I've got one document or one user. With cyber espionage, you've got 1 million users or 1 billion documents. The concept is absolutely old as the sun, but the damage that can be done and the breadth is that is the world we live in today, and that's different than ever before.
Yes, in terms of scale, it's different. The other spin or twist that I'm thinking of is just in terms of so much of our industry that's doing over the last 25 years that has done the various FUD sales and marketing campaigns and is gleeful in one sense when something bad happens because everybody can point to it. I mean, at scale, that's why we have names of vulnerabilities and logos and things like that. But for the most part, in the commercial world, in the private sector, the adversaries that we've been worrying about have been largely going after things for financial gain. It's just how do we make money? How do we make money? The fact that now we've got this espionage thing, it's like, oh yeah, threat actors, in the old days, they were doing it for political motivations. And all of a sudden that's come crashing into to everything. And like you said, the scale is immense.
And
we're largely unequipped in the private sector to handle. You're using the term sophisticated. I use deliberate, orchestrated, directed attacks against specific companies. Most companies in the private sector are not equipped to handle that type of attention, shall we say?
No. Well, then, and I've often thought, and I've been on panels we've talked about, should the government be the one responsible for responding to these kinds of attacks?
Right.
We're on the front lines, right? You're an enterprise customer, you're an enterprise employee, and you're on the front lines being attacked, but you can't possibly have the means, wherewithal, insight to respond. At least with financial, you can understand it. You can look at your own assets and say, hey, this has value. My credit cards have value because they're financial. My social security numbers have value because of fake credit or what have you, or identity theft. But we're not well suited, certainly as private citizens, to understand, well, what has value from a state perspective? What has value as information? To us, it doesn't seem like we could do much with it. But when you're a nation state, what can you do in terms of bribery, in terms of influence, in terms of so many other things that they can do with information, that I do think we need to rethink what we consider to be high value and sensitive. And I also do think it is the type of task, at least in response, that elevates to the nations, to the state. We're not going to be able to defend ourselves. And I say that as a private citizen, not as a cybersecurity expert, but private citizens are not going to be able to defend themselves against attacks like this.
It's an interesting debate, right, Harry? And I think it was Dick Clark's book that really called that out and gave some backstory to, Jeff, your reference in the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The analogy is, should a company here in the U.S. have to defend themselves against a nuclear missile attack? Or is that left to the government? Now we fast forward to today with cyber attacks, and it's a very similar thing, alluding to what Harry's saying. Now that nation states may be going after, let's say, U.S. companies, is it a similar, different, or where does it fall between the nuclear missile threat and the cyber threat?
Yeah.
Well, in the old days,
really hard
we called it
to address.
It is a hard problem to address. In the old days, we called it national defense. Now it's national security. Mm-hmm. I was on a virtual happy hour last night with a lot of very connected and very senior people, currently and retired, that do the national defense type of stuff. I won't say who a lot of them are because we're under. I can never think of the what house rules?
Friendier? No.
No, Chatham House.
Chatham House rule. But like one of the people that was on the call last night is the CISO for a major pharmaceutical. If I said the name, you'd know immediately who the pharmaceutical was. And they were talking about all the attacks that they've been under since the beginning of the pandemic, and the steps that they've taken, and the orchestrated attacks that they've seen, and the monumental efforts and the exhausting efforts that they've been taking to protect, their environment, their network, because of all the COVID vaccine research and so on and so forth. And I was sitting there listening to them talk. I said, I mean, they were doing national security, national defense type of efforts to protect this one particular company, and I'm like, that so doesn't translate to 99% of the companies that are out there. And what we're saying essentially is nobody can afford it. I mean, the amount that it would cost to mount that type of defense against all the different things, it's just not feasible. That's why we're vulnerable. That's why this stuff's going to continue to happen.
And I believe a number of these, the research didn't just happen at the large pharmaceuticals, but at the smaller ones. We were talking about, all companies when they start up, they need to get buy-in at all levels. Well, if you're a tiny company and it is expensive to get to do biomedical research and vaccine research, and you have a small limited time and budget and resources, and of course expertise, say in epidemiology or genealogy, or not genealogy, but genes.
You had it first. Epidemiology, yes,
and genealogy. Maybe your family tree. You really, where would you even possibly have the bandwidth time to defend against a nation state stealing that research from you?
One of the things, though, we're going to have to consider is, all these IOCs are now coming out. And the attacks, the nation state level attacks, those are going to be probably very specific supply chain attacks. Are going to be very specific companies that are targeted as part of an objective. The criminal syndicates or, the underground hacking scene, whatever it is, once some of these techniques come out or the tools are released, that's where you're going to start seeing different motivations. Ransomware, we've seen it with, Eternal Blue, where it's picked up. Ransomware is now integrating new techniques and technologies. So this is kind of a long-term problem. But just simply being able to defend against all the IOCs and check your network, that's like one small piece. We really have to get back to the fundamentals, because most attackers are going to change this code. They're going to modify it for themselves. They're going to utilize it differently against different infrastructure. So making sure that we're not an IOC or signature-based security, and we're moving more towards the behavior. Like, do we have the capability to stop nation states because we are properly defense in depth layered? Those are the things that we have to keep reminding people. You're not going to defend against nation states, but that's probably not who's going to target you next. It's going to be the criminal people that now have access to different tool sets and know different vulnerabilities that are now going to be exploited.
One of my concerns is that the reason that supply chain attacks such as this are so effective is that because it's difficult to simulate in things like a pen test. Because I can hire Tyler or Larry or any of my friends to do a pen test, and I can't tell them, look, we use these vendors, and what I want you to do is I want you to break into those vendors, and I want you to corrupt their supply chain. I want you to simulate that attack. It's probably not going to fly.
This is why Assume Breach is and Purple Team is such a great model to follow, because you have to take that those very specific goals and different starting points. Some people just drop a box on a network and say pen tests are internal. That's not technically a good assumed breach. Starting from very specific threat modeling of what your assumed breach might come in and look like if someone were to gain the FTP account or own the web server with this specific service that has some specific access, what can you do from there? Or if the receptionist is phished, or what about accounting? If we start in accounting and HR, does that change our path or what our objectives look like? And what do you have in place to detect that? If we're not trying to get DA or own Active Directory or do all the pen testy things, but our specific objective is to make an unseen database modification to do an ACH transfer, that is an objective that's going to have a very specific goal and starting point and a different outcome from the end point.
What's interesting, Tyler, I want to start the test. I want to restart my test with you or Larry, any of my friends. I want to say, look, we're using SolarWinds Orion. I'm going to give you admin credentials to that. And that's the only thing I'm going to give you. Go.
Right.
It could be interesting.
But I mean, look, there's an easier explanation too, aside from obviously the breadth that you could do in a supply chain attack. It's if I attack a supply chain. So instead of having to deal with 20, 30, 2,000 different companies' security postures, some might be better than others. I've basically made it least common denominator.
Yep.
I find the one place, the one technology and I target them. It's not that dissimilar, just at a different scale than, the old technique of water holing. If I can't get you because maybe you're, let's talk phishing. I can't get you because you're too smart. You got your techniques. You've educated your users. So you're wise to me sending you goofy emails with links. I figure out, well, find common websites where all these people go. They can't all be secure. And I compromise one of them. Yep. Eventually I make it up, but you're going to go to CNN.com or whatever the website might be. And that becomes my watering hole. So I've reduced my threshold of what I needed for compromise to whatever my least common denominator is. And now I have access, or at least a starting foothold, into all of these customers instead of dealing with them one at a time.
That's really interesting.
And it is a challenge. And by the way, defending against watering hole attacks is an inordinately complex problem because it's something outside of the company's purview.
Yeah.
Right. So you're not in charge of the World Wide Web and every website out there. Similarly, you're not in charge of every piece of software you bring in the company. You can have certain standards and you can ask the right questions, and you need to have the dialogue. Right.
Well, it's why I like technologies such as yours, Harry, right? ZWS, you said you renamed it too, which I really like that acronym. But also there's technologies that, in your example of the watering hole, they take the browser outside of the user perspective, right? The browser is living somewhere else, and I'm just getting fed images back maybe from that browser, right? But the browser lives on a disposable container somewhere.
And ZScaler, by the way, we have something that allows you to do that too. But
nice. Oh, awesome! I didn't know that. Actually.
We actually do. And I don't know what the rebranded technology, what the acronym is on it, but it actually allows you to do just that for vendors. So you can have a controlled session with your secure services, and it's literally virtual and disconnected from your own systems. That's one example. And the idea is, how do you do that? Well, if it's your security tool, if it's SolarWinds, if it's your backup software, you obviously can't isolate it the same way you might isolate a browser. And so at some point you're going to bring in third-party technology that has access. And so at least being able to have the conversation, being able to monitor what is it doing. And being able to profile that, I think, mentioned behavioral analytics, not on the employees, but on the software. Is it all of a sudden acting differently? And then it may or may not be a bad thing. It could be a great update, but you have to have that ongoing conversation with the vendors.
Tyler?
So if that is, I'm just thinking through from a micro-segmentation, zero trust model, and SD-WAN, like call it what you want, and layer 7 firewall. Do you think that when those are well deployed, that kind of next level of defense where we have so many layers, where you're identifying which binary is running, which IP it's allowed to connect to, what data it's allowed to bring across on, during which times, that granularity where zero trust is really trying to get to, would that have stopped pretty much all of the known IOCs that we're looking at here?
SolarWinds, yeah, I actually do believe so. I mean, there are stages that it wouldn't have stopped. Who knows? It wouldn't have stopped the Orion server or their build system getting compromised unless maybe they were running that level of segmentation. But then, how do you stop it when it comes into your organization? The part of the stealthness of SolarWinds is also, or the Orion breach really, is its weakness. The fact that it was so lightweight means it couldn't do that much. Most of what it had to do, then it had to either download additional things and or modify or use software already present. And they had that whole, create, delete, create, exec, delete, recreate, where they would swap out scheduled tasks with a bad binary, but they had to download something different outside of their scope because they were trying to keep their scope very quiet. And those are all opportunities for both detection and prevention. If you are only allowing trusted components in your organization and not newly installed stuff to communicate, or even if it's trusted, you're only more specifically allowing it to communicate with the folks it has communicated with in the past, then any change in that behavior would be stopped. And it wouldn't have stopped the droppers from downloading, but it would have stopped them from moving laterally. It would have stopped them from communicating outward. And that's the whole point of, when you look at kill chains or MITRE's attack sequence, which is if you can stop at least you have stop gaps at multiple stages of their attacks, you're not going to, there's no panacea. You're not going to stop everything possible bad from happening, but you can cause enough damage and disrupt the attack life cycle to effectively nullify it.
Yeah, so they would have, like you said, the dropper, like even any pieces of those stages as they're being done, even having one of those break in some of these, attacks, that breaks essentially the attack. It limits their usefulness so that they're not able to do either the next stage or gain the ultimate objective, and or get usefulness out of whatever they're doing on there. If you had broken the C2 and this application shouldn't be calling out to an unknown domain, it has very specific parameters that are granularly controlled, then yeah, that would have been an effective defense in-depth mitigation. If we follow that pattern and we make sure that we have those set up, I think that's where we have to keep moving towards, which is why zero trust is one of the few things that does kind of scare me when I'm doing an engagement, because it is very easy from a heuristic standpoint to get picked up, and it's very hard to detect or know where those heuristics are.
Joff has joined us. Joff, you haven't heard, there was a breach of SolarWinds. Did you hear about that?
Yeah, there was just a little bit of press about that. I wasn't quite sure what was going on, but yeah.
Welcome, Joff. Good to have you.
Hey, it's good to be here.
Sorry, Harry, did you have a response?
I was going to say, well, in the SolarWinds case, and I would suggest this for any third party you bring in, it clearly, let's just say, and I don't even know if it was the same component, but let's say it was for the sake of argument, needed to communicate with its update server. If that was the only communication allowed, just like your own employees, if they want to communicate with A, B, and C, they have to make requests for each of those. It shouldn't have been allowed to communicate with anything else, even if it was doing the OIP protocol or masking itself to look like that. When it was deployed, one layer of that mitigation would be if you restricted it to only communicating with that one server, it would have gotten the malicious update, but it wouldn't have gone to the C2 servers. It wouldn't have been able to communicate out to any of the other randomly generated domains because that communication was blocked. And again, it's not a panacea, but this is part of how do you put boundaries around software you bring into your organization? And there are absolutely ways to put them in via communications, via network is the most obvious one, if you will.
It reminds me, I've been preaching micro network segmentation for years. I mean, I started doing this, I started doing this in 2005, and everybody thought I was nuts. They still think I'm nuts, but, hey,
in a good way.
Wins.
Well, the technology in 2005, you would have been nuts trying to do that through instrumentation of existing firewall tech. But the concept, you were spot on.
I did it by bringing ISP technology into the organization. I was doing multiple layer 3 networks with MPLS.
And Chroot jails.
And Chroot jails.
It's come a long way since then.
And he didn't have any weekends either.
Right. That too.
No, I didn't. I didn't have a life, and nothing has changed. I still don't have a life.
As to the extent of this breach, does the panel have thoughts as like how deep does the rabbit hole go?
Very, very deep.
Thanks.
I mean, are you talking about the rabbit hole of what chained attacks this is going to lead to, or is already leading to,
or like what IP was stolen, or how many companies were affected?
I mean, you look at the list of companies that, whether it was the chicken or the egg, and Orion was the starting point or the next access, and then the red, FireEye. Like, you think about a lot of the U.S. government, we're talking about nation states. They're very targeted. They're very interested in the U.S. government. That's their target. So the chain of events that's already happened, and maybe those customers that don't have the ability to detect I think we're just starting to unfold this. I think this is going to be much deeper, and there's some interesting. I mean, this is right around after elections. You've got DHS getting hit. You've got U.S. Treasury getting hit. There's either a big objective and a big plan that was worth burning all this at a very specific time, or it was a target of opportunity, which I don't think this nation state works like that.
No, I think it's probably both, right? I mean, because timing-wise, we're in governmental transition. That is the perfect time to target and pull the trigger, because you have an administration that's not on its toes at a transition point in time. It is absolutely, you cannot tell me the timing was somehow incidental.
Although the attacks, as I understand it, go back all the way back to March. So it wasn't. Right. Yes, it was an election year. It's funny because I was going to answer the question when you asked me how deep is the rabbit hole. I was going to answer deep enough that it's going to awaken every conspiracy theorist. Yeah. and I think that's true. Yep. I'm not saying it wasn't timed specifically. I'm just saying I think it goes deep enough that you could pretty much insert conspiracy theory here, and deep enough that we'll never actually really know. We'll know whatever we have observed, but I mean, do we even fully understand the side effects of the OPM data breach just a few years back?
That's true.
No.
And this is easily on that scale.
So I vote at the next actual in-person conference that we see each other, that everybody shows up with a tinfoil hat on, just to start off, because hey.
Well, I mean, you got DHS controlling vaccine release lists, and this all started back in March. Again, you can put whatever conspiracy theory in there, but there may be very specific objectives that, I mean, we know that pharma's been targeted. We know where vaccines are now being released with that list, and we know that this all happened right during an election and or a vaccine release. So, we're probably never going to get the full picture or extent to what this is. But there's some good inferences that you can kind of start to draw around all of those pieces.
Tyler has the most layers on his tinfoil hat. Yeah, and the best conspiracy theories.
The breadth of the targets was enough such that if you want to go conspiracy theory, I think we are literally scratching the surface. In that, yes, maybe it was for the for the vaccine information. Maybe it was for some secret stealth fighter jet that we don't even know about because it was in one of the alphabet organizations that was targeted. Or maybe it's something completely else, and this was an explosion over there. And while we're looking over there, they're actually doing phase 2 or 3 of the campaign. That's the challenge with it being so broad, is that literally it's not hiding in daylight. It's like everything's on fire, so you don't have to worry about hiding.
Yeah, you wonder how it went down, whether they got caught by accident or they'd gotten what they had intended in the initial. We said it started in March, so they've had all this time this year to go, yep, we got pretty much like we're good. And so now let's try some noisier attacks to get some other stuff. And if we get caught, we get caught. That's kind of my fear, that attackers are running with this assumption that I can have objectives and meet them until such time I reach a point where why would I just stop? I still have access. I might as well just keep going, right?
Well, that could very well be, again, totally nothing to back this up but supposition, but that could be what happened here. Is the FireEye thing was a coincidence, happenstance. They took advantage of it. Yep. And by the way, that's might have been in fact that's what let the genie out of the bottle, and now they got caught. Once you start pulling the thread, the rest of the threads come clean, and they're sitting there burning their house down. The attackers try to clean up the tracks. There was when you go back to NotPetya, which was not ransomware but blowing up. There's still theories going around today that it was an attack, that its purpose wasn't to destroy all the data on these machines, but was to hide what actually happened beforehand.
Right.
And now they're destroying all the evidence. We'll just never know.
Well, so we could, while we're speculating, we could take the countdown to 0 day kind of theory on this, which is, entirely likely when you think about it. And that is, they've been doing this a long time, right? And they finally said, you know what, we've got a period of opportunity here. In government transition, let us push this to the max and just see what happens.
In the end, let's make the U.S. look bad as much as possible, and that's the end goal, and then we'll move on to something else.
Yeah,
if we assume it's only
and if you look at the folks, if you haven't read Countdown to Zero Day, please read it.
Oh, love that book.
If you look at that sequence, on the flip side, it kind of makes sense, right? Nation states are going to act like this. They're going to be very, very good, but then at some point they're going to get very aggressive.
I think this book, Joff, might be called Countdown to Sunrise or something like that.
Yeah, Sunburst.
Sunburst. Countdown to Sunburst. Yeah, I think there's going to be a book about this. I can't wait.
You want a starring role, I suspect, huh?
I would love even just like a one-line quote. That would make me so. that would make me so happy.
So Paul opens his drawer today and says, "Why is my computer working?"
Right.
The guy that really needs to be a starring role would be Chris Krebs, right?
Yeah.
It's like,
where they're like,
I was telling him, and then they fired me.
Yeah, Trump fired Krebs, so we were like, well, gloves off now. Like, let's just have at it, right?
Wow. Yeah. Now we could say, what is this? The whole SolarWinds attack as a disgruntled employee?
Could be. That could be another theory. See how you're getting the hang of this. Like on podcasts, we don't have to have evidence.
Conspiracies are fun.
We can just speculate. That's what we do. We speculate.
No, listen, you didn't see me. I've heard the threads where they tie SolarWinds to Dominion voting systems, even though they weren't using Orion. But we could go crazy here.
I do not think it was tied to the election. Everything I've seen, right? You just kind of back me up on that.
I actually don't either, but it's outside my pay grade.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, we can't say anything definitively, again, which is why we have a podcast where we can speculate. And it's been fun speculating. Harry, closing thoughts, updates from the ZScaler front, or anything else you want to share with our audience?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So this is one of the worst attacks we've seen, but it's not going to be the last. We're going to see more, and they're going to. And then, as I say, even though espionage has been around forever, the scale that now they can operate is huge, and it is going to take lots of layers. I think supply chain attacks will continue because they are so effective, and it's not just about putting all your hopes on vendors and or on customers or clients to do the right thing. It's a conversation I think we need to have, and we need to keep adding layers, and we need to keep upping the game. I do think, I got on my soapbox, I've done it before here, about network security and traditional networking, and I think that whole paradigm is irreparably broken. But the marriage of Edgewise, now ZWS, with the ZScaler, other technologies, has really it's been great for me. It's been great for the company, but more importantly, it's been great to provide the kinds of solutions that we do for folks. And I think we're going to need more, not just from ZScaler, but across the board. I think we need more. We need to continue looking at how to keep flipping the page, keep adding different ways, and rethinking the ways we used to do things. I like the playing around with the TLS tunnels back in 2005, but I think we need to do even more now, and the technology lets us. So it's exciting times. It's depressing times. What is it? The best of times, the worst of times?
No, that's actually pretty accurate for this situation, Harry. Thank you so much for appearing on Paul's Security Weekly this evening.
Again, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure. Next time I'm going to do alcohol. I didn't this time because it just seemed weird with the snow outside. But
there you go. Hopefully you can come in studio next time, or at some point
much
next
better.
year, right? For folks that want to learn more, please visit securityweekly.com/edgewise. Or ZScaler. I think. Never mind. The average large enterprise has 24 million vulnerabilities. The good news is only 5% will probably be exploited. But which 5%? That's where Kenna comes in. Kenna Security's modern vulnerability management technology combines real-time threat intelligence, data science, and automated risk analysis to prioritize the vulnerabilities that pose the biggest threat to your organization. Team up with Kenna Security and make the most of your limited resources. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Kenna Security. The biggest problem in security that remains unsolved is flat networks inside the cloud and data center that allow threats to move laterally and compromise vulnerable targets. But microsegmentation using traditional firewalls is too complex and time-consuming. There's a better approach: Edgewise Zero Trust Auto Segmentation. Edgewise is impossibly simple microsegmentation. Using the identity of machines and software that are communicating, Edgewise offers the strongest protection that adapts automatically to changes. Protect any application in any cloud without any changes to your network by visiting securityweekly.com/Edgewise. Qualys has brought together vulnerability management and patch management, letting security teams discover vulnerabilities and apply patches immediately, all within a single, unified app. Sign up for a free trial of Qualys VMDR, vulnerability management, detection, and response today at securityweekly.com/Qualys. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. We had a blast hanging out with all of you at Security Weekly Unlocked last week. Thank you again for helping us make our first virtual event a success all around. If you missed any of the presentations while you were chatting away at our Discord server or furiously clicking your mouse trying to get in the top 10 for Security Weekly Trivia, you can now access all of the content on demand, whether you registered before the live event or not, by visiting securityweekly.com/unlocked, clicking either the button to register or the button to log in to the environment. We have officially wrapped up all of our recordings for 2020 webcasts and technical training. Stay tuned as we build out our schedule for next year. In the meantime, check out everything webcast related and technical training related 2020 on securityweekly.com/on-demand. And with that, we will continue our discussion of the SolarWinds breach, because it's all about SolarWinds. SolarWinds, anyone?
I'll take SolarWinds for 800.
SolarWinds for 800. I did see a quote from the vice president and chief technology officer at Mandiant that said they initially detected the incident because we saw suspicious authentication. And I believe he goes on to be quoted to say it was not SolarWinds, which was kind of confusing in this article. This article.
Wait. That the initial vector was not SolarWinds?
Correct.
What?
Yes. That's what this article said.
It's interesting.
That's what we just got done talking about for the last hour.
Right.
SolarWinds is the tip of the spear.
Some articles said that it was not.
Yeah, that's one of the big things right now is that there's so much conjecture and there's so much that we're getting little bits and pieces, and some of them are contradictory, and some of it's fake news and some of it's not, and that's the really hard part now is separating the wheat from the chaff.
It did say this article did say they said there was a fundamental misunderstanding of how this attack unfolded. We determined the SolarWinds compromise was the original attack vector. I'm sorry. So there was stuff that said, articles that said that it wasn't SolarWinds. You guys are correct. It was, in fact, SolarWinds.
Got it. But from my understanding was that, yes, they detected this unusual authentication over VPN, if I remember correctly,
right,
for a device that had been enrolled in their two-factor.
Yes.
That this was unusual, which led them to trace it back to SolarWinds. So.
That makes you wonder how long this would have went on if that one visibility point was not there. When you start to think about enterprise security and where all your visibility or visibility gaps are, if you miss that one kind of indicator, or you have a gap with inside of your visibility at that one juncture, that could be the difference between a really bad day and a really good day of, being able to detect that. That long-term access could have been, we might not have even known this.
Yeah, props to that engineer at FireEye that uncovered that, kind of process indicator. That's pretty cool.
Yep. And, again, we get to speculate. Now, the question is, why did they need to go and do that to get that resources when they allegedly already had something that was highly covert And was it that they weren't getting the amount of data as fast as they needed, so they needed to find other ways to pivot and exfiltrate? I think speculation abounds, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the big piece of that is the fact that they built it into the build tells that they needed to be able to get into another organization that would be relying on that update and that piece of product. Like there was pre-knowledge of that product being integrated into certain objectives or organizations, aka probably U.S. government of some kind. And so that kind of, I think that alludes to what one of their objectives or targets was, because that's what they were leveraging for that kind of low-level, super stealthy TTP.
Yeah, CISA described this as an APT actor that demonstrated patience, operational security, and complex tradecraft in these intrusions. Yet they tripped an alarm somewhere, at FireEye.
There's always, again, it goes back to there's only so many initial access vectors. There's only so many ways to get something to execute. You have to get really creative to get execution on a box, but that still relies on the fact that code has to execute and certain universal truths around how that execution has to happen on a computer system is in play. And so no matter how stealthy you are and how creative you get, you really have to try and figure out how to blend in to get certain noisy actions done, aka dropping a file and execution.
Yeah, and I think the big one that really helped them in this case, Tyler, was that by compromising the dev process and being inserted into legitimate code from SolarWinds, that all of that stuff got signed by SolarWinds certificates, their code signing certs. So legitimate stuff that everybody was trusting, or in these cases, everybody was trusting.
And the trusted binaries that execute them, right? So that code being in there and that trust, without some of the initial IOCs and without some of those first start visibility points, again, you're relying on something that is very difficult to test. And I am kind of curious why they leveraged certain domains instead of doing something like proxy and cloud fronting using Slack for C2 channels or email that's trusted, that's going to blend in a little bit more. Going to a single domain that had no categorization or wasn't is fairly obvious once you find it. Like I would think there'd be some different persistence, additional C2 frameworks, different persistent mechanisms that are going to be calling out to other more trusted platform or comms channels. Like for the level of sophistication they had, I'm still not convinced that we are seeing everything that they're using.
I think there's someone saying right now in Russian, this is the last time we trust the new people to build out the CNC infrastructure.
Exactly.
They gave one aspect to a rookie.
They did. They're like, let's see what these new folks coming in can do. Let's give them the CNC infrastructure, right? Like that's, that was a mistake.
What could possibly go wrong?
We got this exploit that's been sitting around for a while. We don't know what to do with it. Let's have the new kids build out the CNC and see what happens.
Yeah.
Yep. The thing that I think is kind of interesting about it, Tyler, is that I think they did a really good job of picking the domain, given that, these Orion implementations, would they be calling out to Slack? Maybe not. Would they be calling out to AWS Cloud? Yes, that seems more reasonable to me, that there's some call out to other infrastructure, but it wasn't AWS Cloud, it was AVS Cloud, if I remember correctly. And at the common look, you're like, oh, shit's tripping on AWS Cloud. Well, that's clearly wrong, and you don't read carefully enough, and you let those alerts go by. There was. That makes sense.
Why not use a legitimate one? Like you could have used the EC2 instance name that was provided to you, or an Azure subdomain. Like there seems like there's a ton more tradecraft out there that would have been much better utilized from that standpoint, where they got so many things right and they did some pretty cool infra, and then they mess up on domain name. Like that just single domain name nonetheless. Like that just doesn't add up.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you. I mean, because it's, even in my red teaming, even in assumed compromise tests that I do, I mean, I'll end up running traffic through CloudFront or one of those CDNs. So it's not like it's hard to do that, right? So yeah, for the level of effort they put in and the targets they're hitting, like you would
think that they'd pick some better categorized or cloud fronted, or even using one of the services as a jump proxy. Like there's a ton of ways to do that are not hard, that we utilize. It doesn't add up to the rest of the sophistication. But again, it could have been handed off access. It could have been secondary teams handling those. Like there's a ton of possibilities.
One of the analysis firms said that their analysis indicates that these compromises are not self-propagating, that each of these attacks required meticulous planning and manual interaction.
Yes.
Whoa.
That was my understanding as well.
It's interesting.
So Tyler, on the specific tradecraft and them, screwing up that domain thing, and we've already got some alleged attribution with APT 29 and Cozy Bear, and I forget the other name. But if we think about the level of sophistication or the lack thereof, does this call into question potentially what we do from a red team and the level of sophistication that we put into those attacks, when clearly that the screw ups went unnoticed for months?
Yeah, that is a good, and there has been a lot of discussion around like what is the level of sophistication that a red team brings. Like, is there actual value in that? Like, yeah, we have the capability to look and do UEFI persistence, but why would we do that as a red team? Because that doesn't provide any value to our customer or client, because they're not going to have any way to detect that. Like, unless they're using Eclipsium or like some off the wall thing, and that their threat profile justifies that level of sophistication. Like, you really do have to tailor and match your sophistication for an engagement to the client, because like you're saying, like from an emulation standpoint, these guys made some key mistakes. And so is that something that we should be emulating? Should we be less stealthy for some of our more mature clients? Should we give them opportunity to find those single points of visibility?
Yeah, I mean, that calls into question, and Joff, you said it too. We know we have this tradecraft to be able to go and be stealthy, and APT 29 in this particular case, after the infiltrations through Orion, didn't use that tradecraft, and they still went undetected for months. That brings to question to me: are we doing the right thing by the folks that we're doing red team against? And are we bringing too much A game? And when the actual threat actors, nation state sponsored folks are not bringing that level of A game, are we going too far?
The answer is yes.
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. I mean, it's an interesting question because in our industry, our biggest worry and concern is that we're not bringing enough A game. But
apparently, we're bringing too much.
Apparently, when you get to like we're bringing too much, it's like, what? Hold on a minute.
How'd that happen?
That's where the purple team and collaboration really has to come into play. We have to provide them with more ability and insight to gain visibility and have detection for all levels of sophistication, because the attacks are going to come in different forms. And if you are a target, you may be getting targeted by script kiddies, you may be getting targeted by criminal syndicates, you may be getting targeted by nation states, but you have to be able to detect at all those levels. And that means doing the behavioral detection, getting the fundamentals right, and having that defense in depth properly configured and tuned and alerted at all of those levels. And that is where collaboration has to come in. If you just strictly can protect against A-game actors, yeah, you probably will detect a lot of the script kiddies, but there may be this in-between gap where certain things are just dumb and you don't have visibility because you haven't tuned for those specific behaviors.
There's an article that said that Reuters, it was in reference to the password to the update server being SolarWinds 123. Reuters also reported that hackers claiming they could sell access to SolarWinds computers since 2017. Have we missed this for that long? Or SolarWinds did?
It's possible.
Possibly. Maybe not the build. Maybe they've had access and they've had long-term persistence, but the coordinated objective and the targeted sequence of attacks has some very specific things around it. And so maybe the build process was the outcome from that long-term persistence or access.
So, like, how hard did they work to get into SolarWinds and be like, we have access to SolarWinds. We don't have the update server, though. And then realize, oh, the password to the update server is 12345. And someone goes, wait, that's the password to my luggage.
Yeah.
Honestly, I think it was probably a lot more sophisticated than that. That they likely had, and I'm speculation. We get to do that on a podcast. They likely had an end goal, and they calculated all of the paths to that goal, and to find the easiest path and did a lot of exploration over a lot of time. I mean, these particular groups are being identified as being stealthy and sort of long-term, in for the long con, as it were. I mean, this could have been, 2017 in the making, that they got access to this stuff and just kept it silent because they knew that was a potential path.
Did they use machine learning to visualize all of their attack paths?
I think
Johnny,
they might have
run into the studio and slap Paul on the back of the head real quick for it.
Machine learning, man.
I think they needed that long-term access, though, because in order to figure out some of the build processes and understand their DevOps cycle and what controls they have in place in order to get this code in and do that efficiently without losing access or getting caught before they had the opportunity to carry out the final objective, I think that can take some serious time to understand that. So it doesn't surprise me that if they were in there for at least 3 years trying to figure out, how do we get there? Here's our objective. Here's what we're going to do. And then build that into the code base so that it got pushed unseen. Again, that's not easy to do in a lot of organizations.
Yeah.
Now, can we double back to hold on?
Go ahead, Jeff.
I've been trying to get in. I've been trying to break in here for like 10 minutes. It's okay. It's not your fault, Larry. I blame Paul. I want to double back on
Tyler and then Jeff.
Shut up. Johnny, go slap Paul for me.
I protest.
Oh man,
I want to double back to what Tyler was saying about detection, and we're talking about the A game, B game, C game of pen testing. But what about simply how often are your pen tests just about the detection? It's not finding juicy findings, but it's teaching your customers what to look for. Detection has been a term that's come up several times on the Discord this evening for the last 2 hours or so. Part of me thinks that, at the end of the day, whether we're talking vulnerability prioritization, whether we're talking about what do you need an O day? Do you need to bring your A game, B game, or C game to a pen test? Is a pen test, what does it do for you at the end of the day? Seems to me all of this comes down to detection. Assuming that you've been breached, which is a term that's been floated around a lot the last couple of days in a lot of different venues in terms of discussing this whole SolarWinds thing. What if at the end of the day it's all about monitoring your network and detecting that something amiss is happening, something unusual is happening, because they might be sitting in your organization and your network for months and years, but eventually they're going to do something. And if they're passively stealing data, they got to be getting it out somehow. How do you detect it? Should we start rethinking about maybe refocusing our efforts, especially from a pen testing methodology perspective, on teaching companies how to become better at the detection element of this whole thing?
It's not our job. it's not our job. I mean,
well, what is your job?
I mean, it could be if we get paid for it, right? I mean,
could be.
Yeah, I mean, you have a point, and I think those companies that are doing more assumed compromise or purple team like activities definitely have an element of that. But I think where a lot of us stop short is we're not going to teach you. We're going to say this is the offensive technique we're using. Here's some possible recommendations of things you could look at in terms of detective controls. But it's up to you to invent the detective control ultimately. So not our job. I was only half joking there, right? I mean, to some extent, it is not our job, but it is certainly our responsibility to say, here's the technique. You should be aware that this technique exists. And here's some references where you could develop some defensive tradecraft or some defensive or detective controls around that technique. So we're already doing that. I don't know about anybody else, but I imagine Larry is too. And I imagine imagined a lot of folks are.
Well, I think what I'm asking you, Joff, though, is, okay, that's not your job. Maybe it should be your job. Maybe that's what the engagement should become. And I think you're still a little bit, and this might be just me mishearing you, but you still seem to be focused more on, attacks and vulnerability exploitation. What if and maybe I need to be more specific. What if the detection is not of the attack, but it's of what are they doing with the fact that they have access? I don't know what you call that, but exfiltration. I assume that's a goal. I assume that's a goal of most everybody, regardless what their motivation is, that they want to exfil something.
Well, lateral movement. I mean, to that point, lateral movement too.
Yep.
You can move laterally without exploiting anything, right? Lateral movement could just be I access a file share, right? And that's what we sometimes call lateral movement. But exfiltration certainly is part of that. But that is part of some of the assessments that I've seen is where we test all the different ways to exfil and which ones can you test. I mean,
it is. It is definitely the part of our shtick. But I think that there's a subtle point in there that you're trying to illustrate, Jeff, and I think it's important actually that the detective controls. And I always worry about this actually as a pen tester. The detective controls need not be focused on the specific technique for the attack. They need to be more generalizable to the tactics that the attacker is using, because the actual technological technique, the actual implementation of any one attack can be done in 100,000 different ways in many cases, right? There's probably, take an example like maybe password spraying. There's probably 5 or 10 different ways to do that alone, and that's going to leave multiple different areas of evidence. And the defensive side of the house needs to be thinking in terms of, ultimately the actual tactics and the focus of the goal that's occurring, not so much the technique itself. So I think that's what you were kind of going for. Although I may have morphed that into a little bit of a different discussion at the same time.
Well, I wasn't going for anything. I was asking the question, which is a question I always ask: should we rethink this? Should we be doing something different? Should we try something different? Because and I should distinguish, and for the benefit of our listening audience, and especially those that also listen to Security and Compliance Weekly, because we were talking about pen testing this week. I see a huge difference between the pen testing services that you guys do at Black Hills and Trusted Sec and in Guardians and whatever company Tyler's working for this week. A game companies, and as far as pen test goes, and all the customers that I work with, that they're never gonna be your customers, because they're not gonna pay for you, because all they want to do is get the box checked. All they want to do is get the bare minimum, whatever passes the PCI, pen test checklist, rather than take advantage of the, we have to do a pen test. Why don't we get something out of it? Why don't we do it to actually learn something or actually test our defenses? Is what I'm harping on. And there is a divide between, I assume most of your customers are financial services, insurance companies, large enterprises that have maybe pharmaceutical companies, based on what I was hearing last night. But, companies that have the budget and can afford it and can pay you guys good money to spend the time to try different things and try all the different techniques. That's not the experience of most companies out there.
So that's a true statement. And
so
and
what
you're going to see
I'm
that
saying
division
is,
in the
when I'm
industry.
knocking pen testing, I'm not knocking you guys. I'm knocking everybody else.
So does everybody else
don't?
not
But what Jeff
provide
just said
those?
was, don't hate the player, hate the game.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, that is what he
No,
said.
there's
But I
a
think
lot of
from
truth to what Jeff's saying, right? I mean, there's a tremendous amount of the industry, and this does diverge into a different discussion, but there's a tremendous amount of the industry that can make, lots of money by throwing vulnerability scanners and dedicated application scanners at things, and then rebranding a report, and getting boxes checked for people. That's fine. That's not what we do, as Jeff pointed out. And we do tend to cater to the higher end companies that do have the budget to afford a real, more like 70% manual effort versus 70% automated effort kind of penetration test. So there's a distinct difference in the industry without a doubt. I was talking to a customer today. I mean, we actually hear it from the customers when they come to us. They're like, "Hey, we're not looking for one of the box checking tests." That was literally a phrase I heard today, and we'll say, "Yeah, we don't do that, right? That's not what we're here for." But I think
it's a valid point. Even the smaller companies can get good value out of a pen test if they choose, the good company. If you scope that properly and your pen test company knows how to fit that budget and then provide recommendations that do have those detection capabilities that are, vendor agnostic, blinky light agnostic, and can fit inside of a budget. I mean, you can do a ton with what's built into Microsoft using things like Sysmon. There's free log ingestion.
Oh, totally true.
Like Gravwell. Yeah. So I think the size of the organization does not always necessarily mean the security. Some of the smaller ones we've done actually have been fairly secure, and they're a much harder target if they're properly doing their defense in depth. But you do have to know how to get the value out of a pen test and a pen test company to fit inside your budget. You got to scope that right. You've got to make sure that they understand what the budget is, and you have to get the value out of the detection. That's where these small companies can be agile. They have the ability to know what's in their environment. It's small, and they can put good detection and good depth strategies in place so that long term, they may be a much harder target than some of the bigger, well-funded enterprises out there.
Yeah, so we don't, just to echo that, we don't tend to do red teams, right? Pure, unannounced kind of tests for the small or medium-sized companies because they cannot afford those. Typically, they're more expensive exercises. But we do churn.
But I was going to say, but more importantly, they're not ready. That's right. It would be a waste of their money and a waste of your time.
That's right. It's a mismatch,
and it wouldn't be fun.
But we do tend to do a lot of these
it might be fun.
More assumed compromise or purple team style exercises with companies of all sizes, and they can benefit a lot from them. They're more cost efficient, from our perspective and for their perspective as well, and they get a lot of bang for the buck out of them. So there's a lot of that going on with us. I'm sure with Tyler and same with Larry.
I'm interested to also segue off of this topic, but also see what comes next in the SolarWinds breach. I really truly believe there will be a book. Like there's enough of a story here so many pieces to the puzzle that I think it's going to be interesting in a source of really good lessons learned for a long time that may shape and change. Maybe how we do some pen tests, how we do adjust our defenses, how we become a lot more resilient.
And so Paul, the last little bit that I sort of want to mention about the book, like we've seen all the books on the other compromises, and we've talked about compromises in many different directions. But the thing, I've said it before, and I've said it on national television on CBS Sunday Morning, and I wonder what will come out of this in that, in the U.S., we do not do physical retaliation for cyber attacks. I would argue that we don't largely do cyber attacks in retaliation for cyber attacks. But the point being is that we probably have the same level of access to some of our adversaries.
Yeah, but that's a great point, because if we did, would we have seen this attack coming? If we were infiltrated into this particular group in what I assume is the Russian GRU, I mean, there's Fancy Bear, this is Crazy Bear. Maybe by these fancy terms we give them, which I don't quite understand, does that mean they're
APT-29?
APT-29, great.
And for the record, I say we don't typically. Doesn't mean we don't.
Right.
I said we don't typically.
Well, we don't get caught, and if we did have that insight, we probably wouldn't tip our hand just to save a company because our access
we certainly, Tyler,
very strategic.
But we also wouldn't leak our tools, Eternal Blue Equation Group. We would never do anything like that. this is going to be conversations we're going to keep having, right? These are
it's going to be a lot.
It's an ebb and flow, right? And we only know about certain things when they become public. We may have knowledge of other things. We can't talk about those on the show. Sorry, listeners.
It's the Cold War all over again. on steroids.
Pretty.
So we're going to see
pretty accurate, Jeff. Actually,
we are going to see a massive upsurge in people in the industry. Probably the venture capitalists will start pushing this pretty quickly for securing supply chain side of the house, and probably with a big DevOps spin on it.
Well, but to Jeff's point earlier, like we shouldn't have to, right? We should be able to adopt tools and technology that already exist, which I argue already exists.
No, but I think Joff's saying it more succinctly. What can we do as a show to try to prevent the cyber ambulance chasing that all the vendors are going to bombard everybody with after the holiday break?
Right, because right after the break, all the VC is going to get behind supply chain security, and they are going to push it, and it's going to turn into a big conversation whether we like it or not. And we're going to end up having customers come to us and ask about it. So, we had better be thinking, because, fear does drive money in the purse strings, and it's going to be a topic whether we like it or not.
Yeah. I mean, interesting because it's not a new attack vector by any stretch.
I hear Lee chiming in the background there.
Lee.
So I'm thinking about, shorter horizon, all the folks that have been popped with this latest event, and that are in highly regulated spaces that are going to get all kinds of help to recover and analysis and help that they can't turn down. I mean, you may feel a little pressure here, right? It just,
and by help, you mean all those phishing emails that are going to start coming out?
Oh, I was thinking about the teams of folks that'll show up to fix it. And roll up the covers. We're going to have a little exam here.
Snap those.
SolarWindsFix.com.
That's it. Visit here now, and we'll scan your environment.
I've already gotten those. I've already gotten those email.
Mm-hmm.
I know.
It started.
So I do want to.
Tyler already owns SolarWindsFix.com.
That's it.
Feels like a good time to segue.
So 51% of work from home parents say children have accessed their work accounts. Now, this is really kind of hilarious, actually, and I want to read. So in this survey, this was done by 1Password, who makes a great product, by the way. But nearly half of parents let children access devices with saved passwords on them. 14% admit kids have caused trouble by accessing an account with a saved password. The part that I like or dislike the best is one noted their child got into their bank account and wired money to a random account. I think that the kid probably owned that account, would be my guess. They wired themselves money. Don't.
I find this interesting, Paul, that and I think about my household that my kids would never have access doing work from home because they're potentially virtual, because we have their own devices for that. In fact, we have a Chromebook that was purchased for other stuff that the only thing that we do from that is virtual karate. And everybody in the family, except for my wife, uses it because that's what that machine does. And both kids have their own school-provided Chromebooks that do computer stuff for school. Mm-hmm. And we've caught the little one doing YouTube on her Chromebook. But no, don't do that on your school computer. Do that from your iPad or on the TV. But if I think about that, we're the technology 1%ers. That there are so many families, across the world that you've got to use dad's work computer to go to school. That I can see this very much happening.
Yeah. No, I can too. That, and even if you have a computer, maybe you've got your work account, or you create an account on the computer like I did, and I log into my work email. But when my son uses it, he has his own account on that computer, right? It's not owned by work; it's owned by me. But we separation of duties. Like you don't log on with dad's account.
Yeah, you're doing schoolwork from dad's gaming computer, very similar to your environment, Paul. But dad uses his gaming computer to pay the bills or to access OnlyFans or something like that at some point.
We don't do that. The kids have their own gaming computer, and I have my own computer for OnlyFans.
But again, we are the technology 1%ers, right? I mean,
yeah, I agree.
Well,
we're bad examples in this case.
Yeah, Lee.
Well, I remember a use case I used to see is that the parents are home with their work computer and the kid needs to create a paper, and they've got the whole Office suite licensed from the work computer, so they just they're login as themselves, and they just hand the keyboard over to the kid because they don't want to pay the license. Now, with all the free alternatives right now, that's not as probably as much of a thing, but I could see it happening. It's just more expeditious to use the working application in the computer, and they didn't stop to think that that's really not an appropriate environment to turn the kid loose with for a few hours.
Yeah, and I think that's why we're bad examples, right? Because you might be forced to use different computers or technology just to get stuff. I mean, just this morning in my house, my wife's like, well, this son has a Zoom call at this time, and this one has a Zoom call. And I'm like, my Zoom call starts at 9:30. Like, when does their Zoom call start? Like, we've all got to get on a computer with a working microphone and camera that can run Zoom pretty much all at the same time. And so if we don't have enough, computers to go around, then to your point, Lee, like we're sharing at some point, and that's bad. And to Larry's point, we're the technology 1%ers. Like we love buying computers and technology. We love doing it. We have it for all different, even if it's for one of our kids, after they go to bed, we're like, the new Chromebook, like I wonder if I can sniff the firmware update and reverse engineer it, right? I mean, that's one of the reasons why we're in that 1%. Most normal people hate buying new computers, right?
Well,
a lot of people do.
I think about it, Paul, and I think I have 15 laptops sitting here in my office, all for various purposes. Like, it's
OnlyFans.
Only when I get them, spun up and doing some VMs and stuff, and then the fans turn on. But
yeah, I mean this group is pretty unique that way. I mean, a friend of mine I was talking to yesterday, and he said two words that I thought would totally troll me and probably Joff: Circuit Python. And he's got Arduinos that what they do or equivalents that just run Python. I mean, shit. How quick would be like searching on Amazon to buy those? We'd probably do it during the broadcast.
Yeah, might buy two.
Lee, I don't need to search because I've got a couple. They're literally sitting right here.
Yeah.
Damn it.
I hate it.
So I think we all have an
part
illness.
Of the problem, though, right? Go ahead, Jeff.
Well, I was just going to say, I think Larry's right on track, right? We are totally the technology 1%ers. We are not representative of the overall population.
Except for Jeff. Jeff says he's not in that 1%.
Yeah, but he's weird in other ways, though.
But this only addresses one issue, though, right?
Yeah, I agree.
Tyler?
Let's talk about Signal.
Wait, Tyler.
All right, Tyler, and then we'll talk about Signal.
The last word.
I was just going to say this only addresses the hardware level of like a work accounts getting access and computers getting access. You also have the network to think about. Most people's networks aren't segmented. And so that brings up the point of, from a work standpoint, should the hardware be separate? Should we be issuing employees like Windows to Go or kids Windows to Go so that the hardware is just doing the computing? And once the jump drive or Windows to Go hard drive is unplugged, that computing environment that save passwords, those accounts, are separate from the hardware, and anybody can use the hardware. Like, these seem like there's creative solutions out there that have already been addressed and already done this. We're just not leveraging them in the kind of the same way or thinking about devices in the same way. We have multiple computers and devices, but what if you just had one computer where the hardware was utilized and different people utilize that hardware with different OSs or operating systems separate?
The Signal app, apparently Celebrite, I believe it's the Israeli company, right, that famously broke the iPhone encryption for the U.S. government, if my memory serves me correctly, has claimed that they broke the crypto on Signal. And so what I gather is they posted some details to their site and then took them down. But the link, my story number 3, contains those details in the link of what they posted. And it was something about gaining access to the SQLite or SQL database that contains all of your encrypted messages and or passwords that they were able to access. And one of the commenters was like, and so they need physical access to the phone in order to do this. But if they have physical access to the phone, you can just open up Signal and read all of the messages as well. Exactly. Right?
Yeah. Like, this was one of those fanatic kind of spotlight, I think, get some publicity out of what's going on right now. Because again, you're right. If you have physical access, you can open the app. If you have the ability to unlock the phone, you can get to Signal. Maybe if Signal has its separate passcode from the phone and you can't get into that passcode, then yeah, maybe this is, with physical access, a big deal that you can get to the SQLite and decrypt that. But again, they made it sound like Signal was insecure and the way that they were using encryption was insecure. I mean, we got a bunch of calls around that, and I was like, that's crap.
No, Moxie, but this has happened to Moxie before, and he's very quick to correct it. And maybe he has. I mean, I just saw the story today, but I haven't seen any official statement from the folks at Signal. But usually when stuff like this happens to Signal, for example, or even to LastPass as an example, they're not attacking the crypto that's built into the product, right? They're attacking the environment where these applications run, such as in the browser or on an Android device, as an example.
And Paul, this is exactly what happened. Celebrite admitted that this was not a new and novel technique for them to recover Signal messages. It only works on Android.
Yep.
And it only works because you're able to recover the keys from the key store on the Android device, and you have to be able to do that.
Well, you would have to break the encryption on the phone, so know the password or the biometric fingerprint or facial ID to get into the phone. Because isn't that the key for encrypting the phone on Android? All of them are, well, not, I shouldn't say all, but like the Pixel devices as an example, they're encrypted by default.
But you can turn that off, right?
I think if you dig through the settings, you might be able to turn it off. I haven't looked in a while. I know my first Pixel, I looked and I was like encrypted by default, and every other Pixel since then. At some point, I stopped checking to see if it's enabled by default.
As only a casual Android user, and I probably need to pick up a really actually more modern Android phone just because, to have that volume of knowledge, law enforcement uses the same type of stuff to gain access to the phones, and you don't hear law enforcement, trying to sue Google for not being able to get access to the Android devices, but they sue Apple because they can't get access to the iOS devices.
Right. I guess it depends on your threat actor profile. I'm actually not sure how easy or difficult it would be to, if you got someone's Android device and it was locked and encrypted, how easy and or difficult it is. I would venture to guess it depends on which version of Android, obviously, and which hardware that it's running on as well. Hopefully the Pixel 5 is better.
Again, not as they admitted, not a novel technique. If you have the keys, which that was the point of this. If you have the keys from the key store, you can decrypt the conversations.
Right.
Is that a Freudian slip, Larry? You keep saying novel technique instead of novel technique.
Maybe. Novel was just smoke and mirrors, man.
It sounds like a Freudian slip to me. Yeah. Let's leave it at that.
Just going back to the Wayback Machine.
Yep.
Right.
Homage to one of my my mentors way back in the day. Novel's just smoke and mirrors, man.
So one of the interesting things, though, as I was looking at the Signal, I was thinking about, I've had people coming to me saying, what WhatsApp or Signal, and I was starting to research and discovered with the WhatsApp I can decrypt stuff on multiple devices. Signal only one. I'm thinking, well, that's a step up. But now I'm thinking, did I read it wrong?
No, Signal. Well, no, Signal encrypts everything on all your, wherever you have Signal, it's encrypting your messages on that device.
Yeah. So each device is a separate client where you can have shared on the WhatsApp, if I recall.
Yeah, but
you can do shared with Signal. I.e., I have Signal on my phone and one of my Macs, and both devices can read the messages.
Correct.
But you have to authorize additional devices, and I'm assuming that does some key exchange.
Yeah, it's a linked device. So when I install Signal on my Linux computer, for example, it asks me, or I go on my phone and I say add linked device, and I scan a QR code, and it syncs it, and all the messages are encrypted.
But it doesn't sync historical messages because it's syncing one time going forward. The way in which that encryption works is not, it is per device, but it is separate encryption between the devices.
Right. Correct. Yeah, I don't get the
So
message.
it's not going to go down and give me down decrypted in my old stuff. Just moving forward.
Correct.
That's
Correct.
That's hard.
And Moxie also did say, which is interesting, if you listen to the Joe Rogan podcast where they talk for like 3 hours. Awesome. If you go, it's on my list. Like if we were to recap best podcast that I listened to in 2020, some of those Darknet Diaries episodes would be up there that he released this year, and Joe Rogan and Moxie Spike, because Moxie also said that, like, hey, one of the things we're working on, like right now, Signal's tied to, like, I have to have a mobile device with a SIM card in order to enable it. And it's like, we're working on stuff that maybe you don't have to do that, and maybe compete with some of the other messaging platforms and provide really good encryption and really good implementation of encryption, and also be a not-for-profit company that isn't going to shove ads down your throat or violate your privacy. Like, they don't care. I mean, Moxie said in the interview, there's like, dude, the only thing like I might be able to look up in Signal's database is like maybe your name and your phone number. He's like, I don't have any other information about it. Like, they store nothing about you. I think it's a really interesting model.
So what's next, Paul?
Hey, can we do the story I posted for Larry?
Let's do one of Jeff's stories.
All right, my last story, I think it was number 7. It's all you, Larry.
Oh yeah, I had one of these too. Yeah.
Yeah, you did. You did. So Jeff's story number 7, Paul's story number 9. This is some great research out of Cornell, specifically one gentleman and their team. Mordecai Guri, so both out of Ben Gurion in Israel, as well as some stuff out of Cornell. So this one gentleman, Mordecai Guri, has been involved with 19 different out-of-band data exfiltration techniques for jumping air-gap networks, which is terrifying.
Yeah, so I almost want to do a research project where we identify and describe all of these, because we've covered so many, right? And they reference some of them in the article.
Yep. And some of those, it's like, I feel like when Faith and I did Vapor Trail, like some of our things that we were thinking about there when we developed that, we're like, well, what if we could do that with modulating the PWM to control your fans in your gaming rig? And sure enough, they've got fansmitter, but it's the sound emanated by the fan, but you're still modulating the PWM to change the sound of the fan. So like, that's like, there's ton of stuff here. Effectively, what this particular one does is the access of RAM can, in particular patterns and of various timing, can generate electromagnetic waves in the 2.4 gigahertz spectrum, which is the same where Wi-Fi lives. So it can generate a, quote, weak Wi-Fi signal that is interceptable by standard Wi-Fi cards. I don't know how it's not true Wi-Fi. They're not building a Wi-Fi network. I don't know what type of packets they're building, largely because the research paper is behind kind of like a paywall, and I haven't read it. But it's not Wi-Fi, but it's
2.4 gigahertz radio frequency that's emitted by RAM, which I didn't know. I thought that was really interesting. I didn't know that that happened.
I mean, it can in certain circumstances. Just like you on a Raspberry Pi, you can generate, standard broadcast FM by toggling a pin. Effectively, what you're doing here is you're toggling a pin accessing RAM at a specific speed to generate 2.4 gigahertz electromagnetic energy. There was one that came out about a month ago by which changing the speed of your Ethernet port between 10, 100, or 100, 1000 at specific intervals was able to you're effectively changing the electrical characteristic so that you could use that for exfil of data by just changing the speed of your Ethernet adapter. Like similar types of things, by doing things at a specific cadence, at a specific speed, you generate electrical signals, which then effectively generate RF energy. And in this case, it happens to be doing it at a speed where it's in the 2.4 gigahertz range because of the access speed of the memory.
Oh, but in the Ethernet cable example, Larry, the cable itself emits RF energy, different signatures when you change the speed.
Right, because you're putting data down the line, which is an electrical signal. That electrical signal has some electromagnetic footprint into the environment.
Yep.
So every time there's electrical signal going down a wire, there's some electromagnetic interference that's coming out of it. And if you pulse that signal at a specific rate, you're effectively creating RF energy.
Right. And even with shielded cables, would that happen, or depends on the shielding, right?
Depends on the shielding.
Yeah. So, Larry, I want you to patent your next Faraday cage PC computer case. I'll buy it. I'll be customer number one.
Okay, I will get it. So put your router in it so it protects it from 5G. How's that?
And that too. And something with the fans, because the fans can emit energy. So but we can't block the fans. That'd be
I hear some other folks that want to comment. So
all I want to say.
Go ahead, Jeff.
All I want to say is take everything that Larry has just been talking about, wrap that around all of our conspiracy theory about solar winds being the tip of the iceberg. Cold War.
Yeah. I mean, you look at the research, and the research is coming out of Israel, right? And you're talking about air gap networks and trying to get data across air gap networks. You can make some inferences around what this research is used for, who's what they're trying to build it for, and kind of the target platform, right? This is definitely ICS. This is definitely very targeted and niche case uses that is going to be probably bought and developed and hushed. So all of these novel cases, they're very novel. You probably don't have to worry about them from an enterprise standpoint. But if you work in, say, ICS or part of a nation state, and you're trying to exfil data from very specific targets, this might be useful.
Yep. Now that said, Tyler, and when Faith and I put together Vapor Trail, that was very indicative of, we took cheap hardware that two normal people in the security industry that had a vague interest could do this without nation state sponsorship and for under $100. And we were totally doing this. Like, this is some interesting stuff with significantly more sponsorship, and what are the nation states able to complete? But I think the one that I think that is really interesting is that the technique, and I'm going to read from the article, the technique with different air-gapped computer rigs where the Wi-Fi card was removed was able to leak data at speeds of 100 bits per second.
That's really slow.
Well, but over an extended period of time, that is exactly fast enough, depending on the type of data that you're looking to leak.
Yeah, I was going to say
it's exactly the same.
It's office space, Yeah, who's going to notice?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it reminds me a lot of covert channels, right? I mean, it's the same kind of thing. You've got a very, very tiny little straw, but you can still get data through it. And covert channels are very, very similar. You might flip a bit in the IP header and the application protocol header. It doesn't matter.
Those little cocktail straws in your drink, Jeff. If you drink from those long enough, you get drunk.
That's right.
I mean, you talk about the
great analogy. you keep sipping on the little straw, you're gonna get the bang, right? It's gonna happen.
I don't know if the straw's small enough and you're large enough.
You just gotta suck harder, Jeff.
So one of the things that's going through my head
that's not a mantra for 2021. Good Lord.
Sorry, I hear Tyler chiming in there.
Oh no, I was just saying, like, the protocol matters. So you think about things like Modbus or DMP3. You're talking about very small amounts of data that do very specific things on like a PLC. You're not talking about a large amount of data. So
that's a good point.
The size of the data only matters based on the protocol or devices it's communicating with.
The size of the data matters not. Master Yoda said, right?
It's the bandwidth.
Well, you've effectively changed the ratio, is what Tyler's saying, right? When you only need to make that device do something, maybe you only need 150 bytes. Well, if you can get, if you can get 100 bits at a pace out of that, it might be fast enough to do what you need it to do in a reasonable time period.
Yep. Our argument was if you can run tools on those networks or do enough monitoring of those networks to distill down the little bits of information that you needed, our argument was run responder and get hashes. Like, how much data over a period of time do you really need to get some hashes to get you access to stuff for that data to preload your attacks? Like, those hashes are not long.
Right. I did have a story for Jeff, or I wanted
PCI.
Jeff's.
PCI.
Actually, not PCI related.
It's not PCI.
Jeff's other three-letter acronym that Jeff sometimes uses, NSA. But the Zodiac Killer cipher has been solved. Now, there was multiple stuff, and I didn't go back and research heavily the Zodiac Killer. From what I remember, they never found the person.
They have
right? It's still an unsolved series of cases. And there was multiple ciphers that were involved in this case. And this was one of the ones that was, or the last one that was not solved. Is that true?
Jeff?
Well, I'm not an I'm sorry, I was distracted by somebody asking me about sucking harder. What was the last thing you said? Did you bring up the crypto statue?
So it's similar to that, right? So this is a 51-year-old cipher that was sent to a police station or police in 1969 in association with the Zodiac Killer case. Zodiac Killer still at large. I don't know. I believe there was more ciphers involved, and this was one of the ones that had not been. Is solved the right word? I don't want to say decrypted because that's not really. Is that appropriate?
Solved or well, decrypted technically, maybe not, depending on how it was,
the type of cipher,
just what type of cipher it is. But most people aren't going to ping you. Even me, I'm not going to ping you for saying decrypt or versus solve. The crypto statue, CIA headquarters, 4 messages, 3 out of the 4 have been solved. The last one's very short, and that's why it's avoided solving. But even at least one of the there's a lot of articles about the Zodiac Killer. I was reading quite a few of them. The Zodiac Code. I'm sorry. And I was trying to find articles where they actually talked about what was the cipher and how they were solving it, and there's not a lot of that detail that I have found yet, other than they're showing the messages. But I have found a couple things where apparently one of the things that was tripping them up, and they finally figured it out, was that the person that did the cipher screwed up. And made this huge error, and that was true of at least one of the messages on the crypto statue, was that there was they'd written the wrong letter down, and so it didn't decrypt properly, and you were like going along and get to this. Oh, that doesn't work. So I must be doing it wrong.
Or they did that on purpose, perhaps.
No. Well, if you understand human nature, errors are not usually done on purpose. Well, and especially in a military sense, because you want the intended recipient to be able to decrypt the message and do the right thing. But from this type of perspective, the Zodiac Killer, I mean, maybe he could have done it, but the type of error that he made, because it had something to do with, it sounds like it's a transposition cipher, which means there was some sort of master thing that had the alphabet written down, and the way you get from one character to the next is like over 2 down 1 or down 2 over 1, and
down 1 over 2.
For a segment of it, they went down 1 instead of down 2 or something like that.
Gotcha.
It was,
so
they went down 1 over 1, and my understanding was that it was only one instance, so they were able to get the first chunk, and then after that down 1 over 1, it was all screwed up. And once they figured that out, it was game over.
Yeah, so they've, as far as I know, they've solved all of the Zodiac messages except for the last one, which is very short. And it's I was just reading it earlier. my name is, and then there's just a few characters. And unfortunately, I think they said there's 13 characters. So it's probably the killer's name, but the problem is the way the transposition works, the way that they've solved it, there's thousands, if not tens of thousands of right answers. You can make it work and create multiple names, and that would be problematic if you're trying to. That doesn't mean that somebody isn't gonna look at the cold case file and find out all the suspects were, or look at the census list or the phone book.
Right.
For whatever city was it California somewhere?
I forget where. I want to say it was California.
By the San Francisco Chronicle.
I wanted to say it was San Francisco. I mean, so if you wanted to, connect the dots on the population of San Francisco, probably still going to have lots of names.
Yeah.
So,
and how many of those 10,000 possible variations actually generated human names as opposed to alien-based names?
Yeah, I don't know, but it's kind of cool because they're in the annals of crypto history. Was that a misspeak, Jeff, or was it anals? Sorry, I had to.
No, it's perfect.
It's okay. That's a very Novell response.
Touche.
Or touche.
Touchy.
Is it
touchy? Touchy.
Yeah, touchy. So in the annals of history.
In the annals of crypto history, there's quite a few classic unsolved ciphers that crippies get out their pencils, or nowadays their computers, and they hammer away at them. Not crypto statue being one of them, but there's a book cipher or two or a dozen from the American Revolution that have never been solved that floated out, and they're aware. I don't have them all memorized, but you can Google codes and puzzles that have never been solved. There's quite a few of them out there.
It's really interesting.
Something to do over the holidays.
Cryptos being one, right?
Yeah, and I keep meaning to look at it because the sculptor that had written the thing in the first place, he's don't quote me on the numbers, but the last message is like maybe 27 characters, and he's dumped like 8 or 9 of the characters now, and I haven't heard that anybody has solved it. So
I don't believe I haven't heard, because that would be a big deal.
Yeah, that would be a big deal. And then maybe he could explain why he built a cryptographic statue in the middle of CIA headquarters, because NSA is the Crippy.
It's got some explaining to do.
He does.
Jeff, your story, Linus Torvalds said nothing that looks scary, an important new Linux kernel 5.10 update.
Yes, that is one of my stories. I just thought it was cool that they were asking Linus to comment on the latest build of Linux.
You mean Linus?
I thought it was Novell that they got him to say something. But maybe he does it all the time. What do I know? I'm not a tech geek. I'm not one of the 1% like you guys are.
What was his quote in reference to? Oh, nothing that looks scary. Most of the patches are very small, and the biggest one fixing pin mapping definitions for a pin control driver. I know that's in reference to.
Well, yeah, he was referencing whatever the latest kernel mods or updates to the OS was, essentially. I didn't read it for that much detail.
Gotcha.
I just saw Torvalds, and I thought I'd put it up there.
Always has something interesting and sometimes mostly provocative to say, usually.
Nothing scary here. Nothing to see.
Nothing scary.
Nothing
just
to
a kernel
see.
update. Yeah. Nothing scary.
So one other one that Lee put in was Amnesia 33. Lee, do you want to kick that one off?
So that was the what was it? Forescout research. There are 33 vulnerabilities in the open source TCP/IP stack that millions of embedded devices have, pretty much in firmware, meaning you're going to get, you're not going to be fixing them right away, and and of course, the first thing I did when I saw this article, so I said, "Hey, Larry, check this out."
A vulnerability in your TCP/IP stack. Isn't that a quote? That's a quote from back in the day, old school.
It is,
and in this case, it's not one TCP/IP stack. It's 3 embedded firmware, embedded device IoT firmware IP stacks rather.
And who said IDS was dead?
Does that mean you IP3ly? Never.
Yes.
Oh. Someone take him out back and shoot him.
Many of them are related to IPv6 as well. Like, who puts IPv6 on their IoT devices? Apparently everybody. But nobody uses it because...
I heard it was the new sexy thing.
I know. I've heard it was the new sexy thing for years, Joff, but...
It will forever be the new sexy thing.
Yep. Yeah. So they tear the IPv4 from my cold dead hands. No.
But it is still like astonishing, I should say, to me that at this day and age we still uncover vulnerabilities in the TCP/IP stack. In fact, one of my stories.
It wasn't in the IP stack. It was in the implementations of the IP stack.
Yes.
It was
UIP. Sorry, they analyzed 5 IP stacks. 3 of them had vulnerabilities. 33 different vulnerabilities. Many of them denial of service. A couple of RCEs. They analyzed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 IP stacks. Of them, 1, 2, 3, 4 of them had vulnerabilities. Some of them via fuzzing, many of them either information leakages or denial of service, but a few remote code executions in there as well.
Well,
and a million plus devices and 150 vendors. It's scary.
There is nothing like remote code execution in your network stack to jazz your whatever
on your IoT device, which was one of my stories.
On your IoT devices that are internet accessible. Come on, let's get the bar up there.
My story number 7: millions of unpatched IoT and OT devices threaten critical infrastructure. Armis uncovered that a whopping 97% of the OT devices impacted by Urgent 11 have not been patched, Urgent 11 was vulnerabilities in VxWorks in IPNet, in the IPNet stack on VxWorks. Is that what is IPNet? I don't remember now.
Yeah. But according to recent
IPNet
reports,
is their IP stack for QNX.
Gotcha.
So I got to make a bad joke, but according to recent reports, nation-state actors claim they don't need them because SolarWinds.
Say that about anything now, right? Also, 80% of the devices they found were affected by CDP-PWN or CD-PWN remain unpatched, which is a series of vulnerabilities in Cisco's CDP protocol.
Of course.
Yep.
Of course.
My favorite was actually getting to reference that in a recent report where, like, why are you running CDP in that network? Like, you don't know. No, definitely not.
Because it discovers stuff. Isn't that important? Isn't that asset management? No.
It is, but no.
Not securely.
So is Nmap.
Yeah.
That's like I remember the days when people say, man, that Metasploit stuff is bad. I was like, what's wrong with Metasploit? It's a great way to manage a network.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, think about this. You got these devices that are sitting around with embedded vulnerabilities or whatever. Like, how many home routers are out there that are 10 years old that haven't had a firmware update in 6 years, and they still work and they're still going.
But we just compounded the problem, Lee. Right? We were talking about vulnerable routers for the better part of maybe 14 plus years here on the show.
Right.
But now,
I mean,
look at the holiday shopping season. Now we're all at home going, yeah, it'd be really cool if we had like a smart device that could dispense treats to the dogs, because that'd be fun, right? And we should have a
need a new
dishwasher, and like I need a notification on my phone when my dishwasher is going to be done and all that stuff. And so we've the proliferation of IoT devices.
And these new Amazon Echoes that have Amazon Sidewalk built in, so you can share your Wi-Fi with everyone on the planet.
That's a good idea.
What could go wrong, Larry?
While working from home with those shared accounts.
Right?
Bingo! Because SolarWinds.
Well, just huge. I mean, a huge attack surface of stuff that has vulnerabilities. I mean, but it's interesting. Like some manufacturers, even in just a casual cursory look that I've done, I'm like, hey, you got a little better. Like, you've made some improvements, but there's like the other 80% of the industry, right? It largely has not made those same strides, and that includes devices in the enterprise as well.
Yeah. So Paul, I mean, James Leedy Vidal and I are working on the new SANS course, Sec 556, for IoT pen testing, and I've mentioned this in other shows. We've reviewed so many sets of firmware, me personally, in the last couple of months, and we're still hacking like it's 15 years ago.
You're still bin walking like it's 5 years ago. Anyway, right?
No, we're still bin walking like it was writing the book, the WRT 54G book.
Right.
Like literally we just did a session with SANS that was not recorded at Tech Tuesday, where I taught a module of the upcoming course, a pre-alpha version, and we did a sort of hands-on instructor-led lab, and here's your stuff and go find stuff. And like we found collectively between the registrants and myself a bunch of stuff that we didn't even know that was there.
I was gonna say, how much ODA did you find in that one exercise?
There was probably 15 different sets of things that had been previously undiscovered.
Oh, that's
nice. But not only Linux-based OSs, but also QNX from VxWorks.
Yep.
Like,
wow, crazy stuff.
So we haven't made much progress then.
No. Depends on the vendor.
Does depend on the vendor, but largely we've made it cheaper and easier to produce these devices now, and therefore there's more of them. So like we're still behind the curve.
Like for example, one device that I don't have access to the firmware to, but I was using for work, and I don't have permission to destroy the device yet. Logged into the device via the command line and found that they were not using Etsy Shadow on the device. And that it was Etsy password, and the passwords were easily reversible, and there was a account that was there that was not documented and had an easily guessable password.
And that's
which is true.
You remember the C2 secure script?
I do.
Where it split password and shadow. I'm like, that was supposed to be. We're moving past this. We're going to get this all done, wasn't it?
That was like,
wasn't that like
20 plus, 20, 30 years ago.
I was going to say 30, probably.
Right? More like 30.
In writing the course, I'm using this as a case study, and some of the things that I'm finding, like, how the hell do I go back and do this in a world where these new tools don't exist? Like, how do I crack an Etsy password file? Like, you now, all the tools assume Etsy Shadow and Etsy Password, and you have to combine them in this format. Like, shit, I have to take an Etsy Password file that has all the stuff and make it work.
You're going to go to archive.org and find some Perl scripts back in the day to do it, right?
No, he's not. He's gonna end up doing cat password pipe cut dash D
there you
colon.
go. Get the hash.
Yes, like I have to freaking reinvent the wheel, which is terrifying.
Pun intended.
These old things haven't gone away.
Well, you just bring up Joff to get him to write you a Python script. It's all good.
No. I want to write the Python script and have Joff troubleshoot for me.
Yes.
Like,
so in the day, it would have been written in Perl.
Yep.
Oh, of course. You know what? It probably won't work if it's in Python. You probably have to write it in Perl.
Yes. When working with such old technology, Larry, embrace it and write it in Perl.
No.
No, he says still like no, not going there.
Python 3 all the way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, baby.
No, I agree. Yeah, Python 3 for the win.
What's up next?
Hey, can I shamelessly?
Hold on, Joff. And then Lee, I wanted to get to maybe one or at least one more of your stories, but Joff has a public service announcement first, and then we'll do my story number 16.
Oh, awesome. Thanks, Paul. Hey, quick public service announcement is this. I am teaching a class under the Wild West Hackenfest umbrella that's upcoming in January. It's called Enterprise Attacker Emulation and C2 Implant Development, scheduled for January 19th. And we are going to cover everything from everything from commodity C2 frameworks to threat modeling, attack emulation, anatomies of C2 channel, anatomies plural, oh my God. We're going to study an open C2 RAT framework that I'm developing and do lots of programming language stuff with shellcode execution and delivery, and we're just going to have all kinds of fun. So if you're interested, we've got a link. It's a bit.ly/JOFS, plural, C2 class with capital J, capital C, and C there. And we'll post it in the Discord as well. I believe Sammy is working on that right now. So
Sweet.
JOFS
C2 class.
And Joff, you're doing something special where you're donating some of the profits or something of the like?
Oh, my goodness. Thank you, Larry, for reminding me. And we actually, just last week on the show, we had Chloe Mestagi on the show, and I think she's going to become one of the recipients of our donation. So what we're doing is 10% of the proceeds are going to be donated to underrepresented people in cybersecurity for the advancement of their careers or whatever they choose to use it for. Right now, that demographic is women. And so we have a number of organizations on the list that we are going to donate to, things like WeSys, CyberHer, and
Girls Who Hack.
There's a number of them, but I forgot what Chloe's organization is, but we put her on the list as well. So I'm really excited about that charitable aspect of what we're doing.
So Joff, not without putting you on the spot, can you give me a dollar value as to what you think you're hoping to raise? Like, make me do the math. That's fine. How many students do you have enrolled? What's the course cost?
Okay. Actually, good point. The course is going for $495. It is 16 hours. We're going to do lightweight. We're going to do 4 hours a day. So 4 hours over 4 days. So give you lots of space, and it's a nice training format. Like I said, $495. We have getting upwards towards 50 students enrolled right now. We're hoping to shoot for about 75. So, do the math on that. With any luck, we can get a $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 maybe going out the door for charities.
Yeah. So Joff, what is your cap on the course? You say you have 50 now. You have 75.
So I'm willing to go the whole way. I'm getting a couple of TAs to help me out. As it stands already, we're going to cap at a max of 200, which is a gracious plenty. I don't think we're going to get that far. Wow. We'll probably cap out about 75. What it's looking right now, and everything that we're doing, the lab environment is going to be stood up in Azure. With a very standardized build that all the students can use for basically a development environment as we're going through the class. So really looking forward to it.
Sweet.
Outstanding.
John, I'll talk to you offline about some other stuff, but we'll figure that off offline.
Sounds good. Give me a call.
Lee, did you have other stories you wanted to cover?
I did have one more, but I hadn't really looked at it. It was the one my wife gave us. My number 3, it was 3 million devices infected by basically crapped up Chrome and Edge add-ons. Was like,
oh, I did see that one.
And I was like, what the hell? I thought we were learning to be wary and careful of add-ons for browsers.
Right? And Microsoft was like, we have IE, and we all was like, that's really crappy and really vulnerable. So then, I mean, we could spend a lot of time talking about Microsoft's browser history, right? Ultimately, it's like, well, Chrome has the best browser engine, perhaps. And so we'll adopt that. We'll call it Edge. But yet, one of the downfalls of Chrome, other than their JavaScript interpreter, is their add-on system, which they haven't been able to lock down. I mean, much like they really haven't been able to achieve Apple iOS kind of level standards with their App Store and Google Play Store on Android, the similar problems persist inside of the browser. And here we are back talking about vulnerable add-ons.
Right. I mean, the the thing about what is it? The core thing with the browser is where, memory is supposed to be read or write. Because of the way browser work, you have to have memory that's both writable and executable for JavaScript and the like to work. What could go wrong, right? I'd love to see a time when we really, by exception, have extensions. The browsers don't let them in by default. But that might be a little too severe.
Well, I think they need to be sandboxed, but the browser is now a complex beast of rendering engines and JavaScript engines and the glue that stitches it together. All those layers have to talk to each other. I mean, it really kind of similar to the rings in an operating system, almost. And it took us how many years to almost get that right, or get that right more often than not, I guess I should say. And now we're trying to take that same concept and apply it to the browser. And we're starting all over again. And there were a lot of the browser exploits revolve around basically those kind of like rings of trust, right? Like there's the rendering, there's the windowing engine. Each tab has its own memory space, but a lot of it is shared. And then you get throw add-ons into the mix, and issues abound.
I mean, the browser is the next operating system, right? Like the browser is effectively, we're running apps in there. Everything is real time. A lot of our work is done software as a service. And those have their own network stacks. You start talking about WebSockets. This is where a lot of the C2 and attack vectors are having to go. If phishing is going to be ineffective, getting JavaScript to render is fairly straightforward. And now we're looking at how do we communicate through that using things like WebSockets. This is probably the next big playground that you'll see C2 and attackers leveraging for corporate assets because of SaaS single sign-on and everybody utilizing browsers from that standpoint.
It's interesting. The browser still becomes our crutch for so many reasons, because developing an app for every single platform today is a huge pain in the ass. Also, you don't know what platform your users are going to be coming to want to be able to use your application. You get the oddball cases like me in Linux. And I mean, to a certain extent, I love the browser functionality because Chrome runs on Linux. That means I get access to a whole bunch of applications without having to run them natively in Linux, which is kind of interesting. But
that means you have to run them in the browser, which and especially Chrome, is a huge memory hog and
CPU too, Larry. I know you end up speccing again back to that 1%. We just spec out our machines to be way more power than we need. A lot of that is to run Chrome. Like every time I've spec'd out, put it this way, every time I spec'd out a machine where I'm like, yeah, that should be enough to like get by, right? Then I run Chrome, and God forbid one communications application, Skype, Zoom, Teams, you name it, they're all pretty much equally as bad about hogging CPU. I'm like, yeah, I should have done that 16 core and not 8 or whatever it is, right? But again, we're the 1%. But still, people are still use browsers all the time, independent of native applications.
Hey, before you jump to your stories, Paul, I just wanted to highlight Lee's story number 12 about hackers target groups and COVID-19 vaccine distribution, says IBM. This happy hour I was on last night, the guy that runs it works at IBM, and he actually brought on the researchers mentioned in this article, and they gave a whole talk on this. Really interesting stuff. I would encourage people to read the article. We don't have to talk about it now, but just want to highlight it while everybody's bored, wishing they could be watching us over the holidays.
Yeah, I think it's one thing I've been rattling around in my brain, and I know it's really the counter argument to capitalism, but when we think about open source software, and what if we were to relate that to vaccines? One could propose, I know I'm saying we do this, right? But I got to thinking, like, shouldn't the vaccine be essentially open source? Shouldn't we allow anyone to, once we figure out how to do it, allow anyone to do it? I understand capitalism costs a lot of money to develop the vaccine, and companies want to make money, and there's more than one company that's producing vaccines in the world. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't it be better for humanity to just open source the vaccine and all kind of learn from each other? I mean, we did some of that with COVID, right? China did produce the the RNA sequencing for the virus so that we could develop the vaccine. So there are certainly certain aspects of that are, I don't know, air quotes, open source. Tyler, I don't know if you looked into any, of that in some of your research. You and I have been, you more so than I, but researching vaccines, the way the COVID virus works, just because it's in the news, we want to educate ourselves, right?
Yeah, I mean, really, this is a good framework, and the collaboration around this vaccine and the companies overall that have devoted time, money, resource into doing this. This is the fastest and most collaboration you'll probably see in a while. It's a global pandemic. Everybody's best interest is to get it out there. Therefore, a lot of the EDUs contributed. There was a ton of pharma data sharing, the mRNA sequencing and data between the different organizations and getting that to multiple pharmaceutical companies. Like, we've not seen that before. The ability to do that has, obviously demonstrated it as being effective and a good use case, because we've got a vaccine that is very, very high efficiency rate in a very, very short amount of time. With a proven, mRNA is not the standard way of building a vaccine. And so building on technology that we've already come up with from SARS-1 to move it to this and doing that data sharing between those, it shows what kind of impact and what kind of time frame we can actually come when we start to collaborate. So I think it's a good framework, and I think it will, moving forward, kind of come back to that. With capitalism in there, there's plenty of money that can be made. This is not going to go anywhere. Insurance is going to be paying for a lot of this. So
Tyler, what do you know to the extent of like what was shared? Because I think because the mRNA protein that's in the vaccine is not new. Which is largely a misconception if you read any kind of social media, right? It was actually using it to treat cancer patients. And so did the company that find that be like, here's all of our research? Because that would be awesome, right?
Yeah, there was a ton of sharing around the mRNA. mRNA technology is not new. I mean, it's relatively new for
vaccines,
this particular vaccine, for using it for vaccine transport. But yeah, there was a ton of information sharing from that technology, the spike bonding proteins and the way that works, and the information from SARS-1 that we learned, that was all kind of distributed and collaborated on. And then the EDUs really working through the sequencing of that. We got that sequenced in I think it was 14 days.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So there was a ton of computing power that was put behind that, and then that was shared out to kind of get these trials moving. And stuff was created prior to even knowing if it would work, because they wanted to have the distribution and have the supply in order to get this out. And so, yeah, it was a ton of research very quickly by a lot of people collaborating. So it's not one individual company. Someone had to sponsor it. And obviously, Pfizer is a big name, fairly trusted, and they had the resources to kind of push the propaganda and the marketing engine. But I think a lot of this was so well collaborated that they just had to put it behind someone.
Well, when we say it was moved through quickly, we don't mean that they didn't do human trials as much as they were required to do human trials with any vaccine or medication, right? It's still like something like 40 or 70,000 people still got it in human trials.
Oh, there's even more than that. Yeah. It's well over 100,000 now, and that's one thing that we're seeing, that there's not the shortcuts that, there's a bunch of propaganda around the shortcuts and safety of this, but really when you look at the number of trials and how this was done by volunteers and the amount of resources that were had, this is way better than a lot of the trials that happen over an extended period of time. Yeah, you have that time frame to kind of weed out any of the one-offs or weird cases, but for the most part, we've got more clinical and human trials that have happened so quickly because there's a ton of people that want to volunteer, that want this out there. So it's a testament to how, if you get some resources behind it and some money backing it, you can come up with something that's very safe and very effective.
And largely, I think we did a good job, Jeff, back to your point, right, of thwarting the attacks that were attacking this process, basically.
Well, I was going to say, I can't say much because of the Chatham House rules, but this particular person that was talking about a particular pharmaceutical company, was, and I'm not going to get my dates right, but the very first rumors, the very first murmurs that that this virus was coming about, dates back, I think, to late last year. And they basically were saying they were on it right from the start, and all the pharmaceuticals were, so all the collaboration that Tyler was talking about, plus they've been really focused on it. So, there's more vaccines that are going to be coming, and I don't want to, I feel like I would be betraying the Chatham House rules. This one pharmaceutical company is taking a very different approach with the vaccine, which I think is very significant, and it's coming, but I can't say what it is, unfortunately. But, I think there's money to be made by a lot of the pharmaceutical companies in this instance, to your question about capitalism, and they're getting the goodwill, they're getting the name recognition. Hey, Pfizer, they gave me my vaccine. I'm going to go, buy whatever else they sell, Tylenol or whatever it is.
Yeah. So Jeff, two of the things that I think interesting on the financial front is that there are less vaccines available to the U.S. in that a number of these companies have already sold vaccines to other countries. So
although I just saw a headline, on Twitter not too long ago that said Pfizer's got millions of vaccines sitting in a warehouse with no distribution instructions. So there's
distribution's really hard.
And that speaks to supply chain as well. They have gotten vaccines out to many frontline.
I saw Providence, Rhode Island was getting them. That was part of
my wife. Actually, full disclosure, one of the reasons why I researched the vaccine and been talking with Tyler, who's also researched the vaccine, is my wife actually got the first round of the Pfizer vaccine on Monday night, which I mean, and healthcare workers were ecstatic. I mean, they're on the front lines working with COVID patients, and those are the first people that received it. I believe there are elderly nursing home patients that also qualify that have received the vaccine in many states across the U.S. as well. And certainly the U.K. Came before the U.S. in getting the vaccine. Many of their elderly population has already received the vaccine as well.
Yeah, William Shakespeare, talk about old people. He was one of the first ones in the U.K. to get it.
Yep. Exactly. No relation. And I think this is thinking about this financially, Paul, I think, Pfizer and these other companies that are basically not getting paid for the vaccine, but the work that they've been able to do complete in this short period of time with the RNA and all this type of stuff will lead to many other things that they can sell and make a profit. And this is effectively a research cost. It's a loss cost.
Right. Loss leader.
It's a loss leader, exactly, which is. And it's going to be huge for so many of these companies for things moving forward. Yep.
I found a really cool article. The title really got me, because and as I unpack the article, there's a lot of nerd stuff in there. There's some hip hop in there, and there's the quality issues in there as well. And I was like, but all in a positive light. And I want to unpack it too, because I think we can do better. But there is an individual, and I remember I didn't actually have her name in the quote here, but it's my story number 16, and the title was "I am the dopest NASA engineer you will ever meet." A 26-year-old turns a mistake of being added to an honors geometry class to becoming a rocket scientist. True story. African-American woman accidentally gets added to an honors chemistry class, and she was excited, and then they're like, no, like it was by accident, and she was like, no, I still want to stay in the class. They're like, well, you can transfer to this other class, and she's like, no, I want to stay. And then she got an A, and turns out that now she's a NASA scientist. Like, great story. I don't want to see this happen as a mistake. I want to see this happen on purpose, right? That we take people with the appropriate skills and aptitude and apply those to provide them with the opportunity to be awesome in a lot of these fields, such as science and engineering. The other part of the article was like she's got this thing for hip hop and like makes videos about for students that are like learning about the different units of measure and like produces hip hop video on it, which is just really awesome. And it's like the same person, and she's received honors from various organizations about her work. It was just a really positive and inspiring story that I wanted to kind of end our year on.
I mean,
it's an awesome story.
Go ahead, Lee.
I was going to say it's an awesome story. I think the headline doesn't do it justice. I mean,
agreed. Read the article.
I mean, no offense to anybody. I think that they could have come up with a, this is not your ordinary rocket scientist. Might be a better thing, but the heck with that. This is just amazing, and it is a good feel-good story, and we need more of those.
Yes. Her name is Deja Williams, St. Louis-bred math and science geek in her third year at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Los Angeles, California.
I think that speaks to, like, really when you get pushed past your comfort zone, you can almost always step up to that if you take the challenge on. That's, I mean, that's ultimately most of the personal development that I've done. Almost all of it is just pushing yourself out of comfort zones and taking on or learning something new in a new way, or looking at something in a different way, which is kind of the hacker mentality, right? But doing that in all aspects of life, if you push yourself outside that comfort zone, that's the only place that you grow. So this is a great example of how that should work and how that does work.
It's interesting. She addresses some of the language gaps, too. In an interview, she says, sometimes education, at least in math and science, can be a very traumatic experience, especially for kids of color. They're not necessarily taught in the language you learned growing up, right? And many of us grew up in different areas and different backgrounds with different, styles of language. That maybe don't translate. I mean, we see that in the boardroom all the time, right? Like, we're nerds and we talk our nerd speak, and we know that doesn't translate into the boardroom. So we need a more common language. And Deja's using hip hop songs to like bridge some of that language of math and science into more popular culture. I think that's really cool. I mean, being a huge fan of hip hop, of course, I think that's so awesome. We need that for security. Kind of like dual core, I guess, is one example of that, one could say.
Although you should also look at Bo's awesome Spotify album, Joff. I hope you've listened to it, but Bo Bollock's album is, I'll give a drop here. Like, he is a security practitioner that also plays phenomenal guitar and has a nice soundtrack that really, I can't speak highly enough of it. It is it's one of my favorites right now.
How does one find it?
Let's see. I will drop a link into Slack and have someone upload it somewhere.
Yeah, I've seen them play. Well, I've seen Bo and Joff jamming out in Deadwood.
We did.
And both of you are amazing musicians.
All right, thank you, sir. I don't often get a chance these days, but music's good for the soul, for sure.
Yes, it is. Yes,
Jeff, why don't you go get your guitar and take us out for this episode? Come on.
Well, if I had a guitar. Sorry, can't help it.
I'd say piano, but I know that's hanging on the wall in your dining room.
Yeah, it is.
Which is ironic that I'd love to take up music and I never find the time just because so many other competing projects and stuff. But I have a guitar, I have a ukulele, and I was like, I should probably learn the piano. Meaning I should buy a piano and not learn the piano.
Mm.
But, so
great piece of furniture,
right?
You're just it's good. You're just looking to redecorate.
Exactly. So I've got too many other things to deal with, and and of course I buy new digital radios, and like they're sitting right here, and like, oh yeah, it requires some setup and some Raspberry Pis, and this is going to be awesome. Like, yep. Well, it's only been 3 days, so I've got some hope yet. So.
Any other stories or things you want to mention in our last Paul Security Weekly for 2020?
It's been good. It's been real. It's been 2020. So let's move on.
Let's look forward to 2021 and hope it's better than 2020, which did in 2020 set the bar really low.
Yes, it did.
So, the only thing I'd like to say, as moving out of 2020, Paul, is that for much of 2020, it's been a dumpster fire, and I think moving towards the end of it, that dumpster fire has been picked up and thrown into a larger dumpster, which is also on fire. So, maybe we're hitting or about to hit the lowest of the low, and hopefully we can only go up from here.
All uphill
look
from
forward
here,
to look forward to seeing many of you when things are sane, and we love our community. And
I don't know if we're getting sane again. Maybe when we're healthy.
We can still be insane and very healthy. So.
Yep.
Well, here's to seeing all of you in person. Hopefully, sometime in 2021.
Seriously,
that's what I'm looking forward to.
Amen.
Seeing you in person and travel where it's appropriate, and not having to travel as much where it isn't.
Right. Absolutely. Well. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching this episode of Paul Security Weekly. That'll do it for 2020 on this show. Larry, take us out.
Over and... out.